Good evening, members of the public, and welcome to this meeting of the Planning and Licensing Committee. We are again starting an hour earlier in an attempt to get rid of the backlog of planning applications. And again, I'd like to thank Mr. Johnson and his team, who have been working extremely hard to catch up on a backlog in difficult circumstances. So that's why we're an hour earlier. And so welcome to all members of the public who joined us in person. And if you are speaking this evening on the planning applications, and again, welcome to those who are following by Zoom. We've also got this evening, as you see on the top right-hand side of the screen, Mr. Hodgett joining us remotely this evening. He's self-isolating at the moment. There may be slight hiccups, not just because I'm IT unfriendly and chairing this meeting, but there may be some slight hiccups. Please bear with it. We'll make it as smooth as we can. And again, if you will remember, members, please, to have your microphones on when you are speaking, even when it's a matter of asking Mr. Hodgett any questions and so on and so forth, because otherwise those listening in online won't hear us. And again, I would say to members of the public, if you're here, either observe or take part in just one item, you're very free to leave after that item has been debated. Again, you're equally free to remain and follow the rest of the meeting. I generally give a short adjournment in these circumstances to clear the room if you wish to. So if we now move to the agenda properly, please, do we have any apologies, Tom?
Chair, we've received apologies from Councillor Kemble.
Councillor Ball, thank you very much. Declarations of interest, please, item 2. Sorry, have I missed one? I've missed the minutes, thank you. 2 bits of paper was quite possibly confusing me. May I just have a show of hands that thank you, Councillor Beggy, Councillor Cross, all those in favour that those are an accurate record of the previous meeting, thank you. And we now move into declarations of interest. Councillor Beggy.
Non-prejudicial, and it won't affect my voting, but I live no more than 100 yards on the same road as the Uppingham Road development.
Thank you, but you are quite happy to...
Quite happy to debate.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the Uppingham Road proposed development. On the Uppingham Road proposed development, I know the farming family, as I know many farming families in the area and many other families, but there is no pecuniary interest. Is that all right?
Yes, as long as you come here and with an open mind.
Same thing from me, Chairman. Probably don't know them quite as well as William, I don't know, but I'm non-prejudicial, non-personal interest, so I'm happy to take part as well.
Yes, I'm a resident in the property adjoining it. I've raised objections to date, so I shall be making a statement as a ward member, but I shall withdraw after that for the remaining part of the debate.
Thank you.
Councillor Oxley.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, 2021-0967 Adderley Street. I actually live on Adderley Street, and I can just about see the development from my upstairs window. However, the person who sold the land to the developer is a good friend of mine. I've worked with him for many years, the local funeral director, and so I actually will not take part in the debate, and I will leave the room while the debate's taking place.
Thank you very much. And equally, on that same application, this is a matter of probity. I am distantly related to the applicant and I know him well, but I have no pecuniary interest. It is simply a matter of declaring the connection. We're a small county, and I think everybody's aware of that, but I don't feel that I'm prejudiced. I've got an open mind. Thank you. So that is declaration of interest, item 3 on the agenda. We then move to 4 petitions, deputations and questions. And again, for members of the public who are not familiar with our procedure, we take any deputations. I'm informed there are no questions as such, but we take any deputations at the point at which that application is considered. So if we now move to the main body of this evening's meeting, item 6, the planning applications, and the first one is the Ridlington application held over from the last meeting. So if we could move on to that, please.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Next slide, please, Justin. So this is a site between Hollygate Road and Church Street in the village of Ridlington. It's been associated with a farm, the buildings of which were located behind it. Next slide, please. This is a closer view. You can see to the north of the site there are the existing farm buildings. A bit further to the north between Main Street and Church Lane is the parish church. And there are some other listed buildings around the site, which you'll see on a separate plan in a moment. In particular, to the northwest corner is the listed building known as the Dower House, and then the larger building beyond that to the west is the old rectory. Next slide, please. So this is a plan that shows the site just outlined in red. It shows the planned limit to development for Ridlington shown by the black line, and the purple lines are the extent of the conservation area. The green areas around the edge of the site are depicting an area of important frontage, which was designated in the existing local plan. So that the site is affected by that open frontage, but it's not an open space policy as you discussed in the Great Casterton application at the last application. It's just the frontage. Next slide, please. Again, this is the plan from Historic England website, which shows the listed buildings, and they're identified by the small blue triangles. So you can see there is a rather plethora of listed buildings around the site, including the church at the back and the small cottage between the church and the site itself. Next slide. This is the proposed layout of the site. It doesn't show it in context with the neighbouring properties, but we'll come to that later. It's basically over 6 bedrooms over 3 floors. There is a separate garage with an element of accommodation above that turns its back on the right hand side there onto Church Lane. Next slide. So these are the elevations. The top one is the elevation from the front, from Hollygate Road. You can see the outline of the Dower House to the left of that, and there are some trees on the boundary in the front garden of the Dower House at the side of where the proposed building would go. Now, this is a revised elevation. You can see the lower wing on the left-hand side of the new house. That was lowered to bring it more in line and just below the level of the Dower House to reduce any potential impact on that, which is a listed building. That part of the Dower House, as you'll see later, is a modern extension. And then the view below is the view from Church Lane, but it doesn't include the garage, which would be in the foreground. Next slide, please. So the top picture here is from the rear. You can see on the left the side elevation of the garage. The Church Lane is on the left-hand side there, and then the bottom elevation is from the front garden of the Dower House. But again, it doesn't include the existing trees that are on that site. That lower image to the right-hand side does show a line of trees facing Hollygate Road, most of which are conifers, which would be fairly inappropriate and which will be replaced with alternative planting. Next slide, please. So this shows the the layout of the site more in context with the Dower House, and the pink area is the more modern extension on the Dower House. And then you can see that those larger farm buildings down to the north. The red around the trees at the front indicates those that are to be removed, and the green ones show you those that are already there. And you can see most those on the left-hand side are those within the front garden of the Dower House. There's an existing access into this site on that corner, on the southeast corner. Next slide. Again, this shows the proposal in context with the Dower House and the extent of its extension. So that again, the top one is from Hollygate Road, showing a sort of a street scene, and the bottom one is more from Church Lane, looking across the farmyard to the north of the site towards the gable end of the Dower House, more in the distance. Next slide. So again, this is a similar view to that one that we saw on the bottom of the previous slide. So the application site is on the higher land slightly to the left of the photograph. You can see the Dower House gable end in the distance there with its extension, and then the agricultural buildings on the right hand side. Next slide. This is the existing access into the site. You can see the Dower House in the background to the left. And to the right, you can see the listed cottage, and just above the cottage, you can just make out the tower of the church, which sits further to the north. And you can see some of those trees on the frontage that would be taken out and replaced with more appropriate landscaping scheme. Next slide. This is from further down Hollygate Road, looking back across the frontage of the old vicarage, and this stone wall is listed in its own right on the front of the vicarage. Next slide. This is getting closer to the site itself. This entrance on the left is to the Dower House, and where you can see that the top of that red car, that's on the front Hollygate Road edge of the site itself. And again, you can see those trees that would be taken out there, which are not really appropriate for the conservation area. Next slide. This is looking back in the opposite direction down Hollygate Road to the west. Next slide. And this is from the bottom of the northern end of Church Lane, looking back towards the Hollygate Lane junction, and the access to this site is just on that top right-hand corner of Church Lane. You can see on the right-hand side there that this site is slightly elevated from Church Lane. This frontage is part of that important frontage, although it's not particularly spectacular in terms of its landscaping, and the scheme will enable that to be improved as part of the landscaping scheme. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the view looking back the other direction down Church Lane to the north. Next slide. And that's the Google Street View image of a similar shot that we saw earlier with the different time of year. But again, you can see the Dower House with its extension at the back and the church tower in the distance. Next slide. This is a computer generated image of the proposal. So this is taken again similar from the last slide, from that corner looking into the existing access, which would be reused. It does obscure the view of the Dower House, but those trees in the background are those that are in the front garden of the Dower House. So next slide. So this application has come to committee really because of the policy situation. Ridlington is a restraint village in the current development plan, where new development wouldn't normally have been allowed. In the local plan review, there was a review of settlements, and villages, including Ridlington, would have been enabled to accommodate a small level of infill development. But because the locational policies of the local plan are now out of date, as you know, because of the withdrawal of the local plan and the 5-year land supply, that restraint village policy has already fallen away in terms of its weight in the existing plan. So overall, in policy terms, the development is now acceptable. It's within the planned limits to development. It's not even outside the PLD. In terms of the character of the area and the heritage, the site, as you saw, was in the conservation area. The NPPF says significant weight should be given to development which reflects local design policies and government guidance on design. And as you can see, the proposed design of the scheme is wholly appropriate in terms of the local sort of Rutland vernacular in terms of design and materials. There might be a limited impact on the setting of the dower house at the back, but that would be less than substantial. Next slide, please. Yeah, we've been through the materials. In terms of residential amenity, the occupier of the dower house had some concerns about it and the impact on his property. But it is set quite a way forward of his property, and he's not entitled to a view out to the front, as members will be aware. And there are existing trees within his front grounds that will soften the appearance of the building. It won't have any sort of over dominant or loss of privacy or anything of that nature. The highway, the existing access does exist there. You can see that there's an existing low wall, and it's proposed to retain that sort of feature, and any landscaping that's put in there or any new boundary hedge will be set back so that there's an adequate visibility display across the corner. So in conclusion, it is now considered to be a sustainable location, sustainable development, and on the basis that the restraint village policy has now fallen away, it is recommended for approval.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodgett. So if I could ask Councillor David Johnson to come forward, and I know that he's going to, I don't know which order you're going in, but there's a member of the public who for family reasons can't actually be here, but has given Mr. Johnson a statement to read out. I don't know if that's coming first or second.
Speak. Right. I could do that one first if you like, on behalf of John Morris.
Thank you. It might be. That's the order I've got it on my bit of paper.
Fine.
It's entirely up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. This is a script from John Morris, who lives at the Dower House, which is the listed property that is closest to the proposed new development. He states, I note from the report that Riglington is classified as a smaller village, in which normally only small-scale development on infill sites, redevelopment of previously developed land, and the conversion of existing buildings will be supported. The proposed scheme is clearly not a small-scale infill development. It is described as being in the style of a late 17th century manor house with 6 bedrooms, 3 floors, a 3-car garage with further accommodation above. It is also not a redevelopment site or conversion project. The land is a greenfield site which has not previously been developed. The report also states that there is a statutory obligation on the local planning authority to ensure that the character of the conservation area and the setting of listed buildings be preserved or enhanced by new development. This is clearly not the case due to the size, scale, and location of the proposed development. It will damage the setting of the neighbouring listed buildings. The footprint of the new property is more than twice the size of the Dower House and almost 4 times the size of Church Farmhouse. These are 2 listed properties that are the direct neighbours of the proposed new development. The new property has been located in the corner of the site that is closest to the Dower House, which is only just over 10 metres away. The conservation officer pointed out in initial comments, quote, I do have concerns about the positioning of the house and its impact on the setting of nearby designated heritage assets. By positioning such a large house in close proximity to the western boundary, it would obliterate the present view across the site to the Dower House and the old rectory, as the submitted illustrative view demonstrates. That illustrative view, referred to by the Conservation Officer, is on page 84 of the report. It can be seen that the only visible part of the Dower House that remains following construction will be the 2 chimney pots sticking out from the top of the tree in the centre of the picture. It appears that the Conservation Officer has now been satisfied by a 60 centimetre reduction in the height of the proposed developments, stating, anything that will lessen the impact on the neighbouring listed buildings is welcome. This conclusion is not consistent with the statutory obligation to ensure that the setting of listed buildings is preserved or enhanced. In fact, The Conservation Officer's initial concern still remains. The new development will obliterate the present view across the site to the Dower House and the old rectory. Other contributors to the planning process have also objected to the scheme, including Redlington Parish Council, who are concerned by the height of the proposed development compared to properties in close proximity. Another neighbour who states that the height of the proposed development is completely excessive and will completely dominate the neighbouring listed properties. And a further neighbour that states that the proposed building will tower above the thatched farmhouse, meaning church farmhouse. Given all these concerns, I would urge the Planning Committee to reject the current application. Thank you for your time and consideration. John Morris.
Thank you very much indeed. Members, we are in these circumstances. It would be inappropriate for Mr. Johnson to try to answer questions on behalf of the objector. So we simply have that on the table. You've heard the neighbour, and I'd now ask Mr. Johnson to present the parish council thing. Again, you've got 3 minutes. I will be not too harsh on the third minute, shall we say, and 3 minutes for questions, members. So back to you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I sit before you as chairman of Redlington Parish Council. I represent the view of the parish council and other people who live their lives in the village. Redlington is a conservation village and an Article 4. It's a cul-de-sac village with one route in and the same route out. The heart of the architectural centre of Redlington has been protected for decades by the village being classified as a restraint village, which excluded new builds. The Planning Officer's report states that this protection has expired. It goes on to say that replacement criteria for a Redlington within the local plan review would not have been dissimilar, no permitted development in such areas. However, the local plan review has recently been withdrawn. This leaves the village currently without local protection, as an interim is governed by the National Planning Guidelines. This application is located within the heart of the architectural centre of Redlington, surrounding the site of the following. To the north and very close is Church Farm. Also to the north is the parish church. Immediately to the west are the Dower House and the old rectory. To the east is Redlington House and a bakery. Each one of these 6 buildings have Grade 2 listed status. The Conservation Officer stated in his report that he had concerns about the positioning of the house and its impact on the setting of the nearby heritage assets. The Parish Council share those same concerns. In 2011, an application for a small 1-bedroom bungalow sited at the entrance to the village and away from the listed buildings was refused by Rutland County Council. At that time, the village was deemed unsustainable for new development, and this was the reason for not granting the permission. This was 10 years ago. Since that date, nothing has changed to improve the sustainability of the village with regards to new developments. Even without any new developments, there continues to be erosion of the conservation status. The number of vehicles accessing the village has greatly increased due to households making more use of home deliveries. In addition, Rutland County Council has recently granted retrospective planning to a number of new businesses situated on farms to the west of the village. These businesses have generated an increase in vehicular traffic, articulated lorries, grain lorries, couriers, staff vehicles. Albeit these new business premises are not within the conservation boundaries of the village, the traffic supporting them and their employees have to travel through the conservation village on the cul-de-sac road around some dangerous bends. The proposed development has garaging for 3 vehicles. This has the potential to create multiple daily journeys from the property, adding to the existing traffic flow. In 2020, the Parish Council were approached by a number of parishioners concerned about the increase of traffic travelling through the village. Some of that concern related to the potential dangers on the section of road at the double bend on Top Road. The information which was gathered as a result of these concerns was collated and passed to both the Planning Department and Highways. The initiative was totally independent of this application. This application has an entrance and exit that joins these double bends. It is an existing access, but has not been significantly used for many years. The application is for one very large property. It will provide a very small decrease in the housing requirements in Rutland, making little difference to the figures, but would have an adverse impact on the centre of historic Bridlington. To conclude, Church Farm, a listed building, the closest neighbour, will be dwarfed by this application. The view from the south of the parish church, a listed building, will be lost. The village is no more sustainable now than 10 years ago, when it was deemed unsustainable for a new development. In fact, it is less so. The conservation area is being eroded. This large and imposing development will not preserve or enhance the listed buildings as required in the national policy framework. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Members, you have 3 minutes in which you can ask questions. Councillor Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Johnson. You mentioned the positioning of this proposed development. Would a change in the position alter the views of the village, or is the main concern the size and height of the development?
Thank you, Councillor. My points are that in 2011, it was an unsustainable village as classified by Rutland County Council, and nothing has changed. The traffic that is coming through the conservation village has increased dramatically. So where the property is or the size of the property is irrelevant to the argument of the parish council. So I cannot answer that question about a smaller property other than what I've stated in my text, that it's the increase of traffic and also, to be honest, fairness for 2011 for the lady who applied for a bungalow and was refused on the grounds that it was an unsustainable village.
Councillor Cross, do you want to come back?
If I may. Thank you for that. I fully understand what you have been saying. However, we have this proposal in front of us, and in my mind, it does seem to be rather overpowering for that part of the village. Positioning was mentioned in the deputation and was of great concern to our conservation officer. Would a change in the positioning, maybe to do with the levels of that ground, because it is probably 8 foot above the carriageway there, help in any way? Or is it the actual size of the house, the number of bedrooms, the height that is of more concern to the parish residents?
Thank you, Councillor. As I say, I don't speak for myself, I speak for the parish council. That is not a question as to whether a smaller property or a repositioning on the land has been discussed. I can't give their view. We had the planning application in front of us, and it was that we discussed, evaluated, and gave our opinion on, the 7 members of the parish council. I can't answer that without going back to the parish council and speaking to them directly about the question that was not on the table at the time.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. That is time up, and thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. You can return to your previous seat. Thank you. Councillor Cross and I are the ward members. So if I may, Councillor Cross,
Sorry,
come
Chair.
in at this point.
Oh, sorry.
It seems to me there are 3 things on this, that it is policy, and I have every sympathy with the parish council wrestling with the implications of changed policy over the past few years. I think members will be sympathetic to that, but the situation is, as Mr. Johnson said, the village actually hasn't particularly altered in sustainable terms. The policy may have altered, the village hasn't. When you look at the lifetime of this application, some effort has been made, clearly not enough as far as the resident of the Dower House was concerned. The height has been lowered. The actual location on the site has been moved. So it has to a certain extent met the objections from the immediate neighbour. On the traffic implications, again, I've attended a couple of parish council meetings. I have every sympathy with what is happening on the ground, but as you will know, members, and I'm looking to my left to the highways engineer, this is something which is measurable, and anecdotal evidence is not sufficient weight to overturn the guidelines. So if I'm looking at it objectively, I cannot see reasons for refusing this. And again, bearing in mind, although it's a very large house, and even if we allow a little bit of artistic license with the pictures we've been shown, it's not actually that inappropriate. I personally can't see reasons for refusing, but Councillor Cross, I'll bring you in. We may differ. Sorry. I've completely missed my agenda note. The agent. I'm sorry, my apologies.
I'm going to largely reflect what you were saying there, I believe. The application has been through several rounds of revision and consultation. It's been rigorously assessed against national and local policy and has now been recommended for approval. Whilst the site lies within the Riddlington settlement boundary, the development plan policies are out of date, as the council is unable to demonstrate a 5-year supply of deliverable housing. Therefore, as per the NPPF, the council have a duty to grant permission unless the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. If decision makers choose not to follow the framework, clear and convincing reasons for doing so are needed. Following discussions with the Conservation Officer, and as already mentioned this evening, the height of the proposed property's western elevation was reduced so that the ridge height now sits lower than that of the neighbouring listed property, the Dower House. The Conservation Officer concluded, I no longer see any reason from a conservation point of view why permission should not be granted for the proposed development. Only once the significance of a heritage asset has been properly assessed is an individual able to draw conclusions about any resultant harm arising from the proposal. This is an assessment which has been undertaken by us, by the architects, by the heritage consultant, by the planning officer, and by the council's conservation officer. And there is absolute consensus across the board that the proposal will result in very limited impact. The committee report clearly concludes that the proposal would preserve or enhance the character of the conservation area and would not detract from the setting of nearby listed buildings. The proposed dwelling is also considered to be commensurate with the scale of the adjacent listed buildings. With regard to impacts on neighbouring amenity, the proposed dwelling would be set forward from the adjacent listed building, the Dower House. And the design also incorporates roof lights rather than windows on the western elevation to prevent overlooking, and further planting is also proposed to the rear of the dwelling. Once again, it is mutually accepted by the applicants and officers that impact on neighbouring amenity is acceptable. Just quickly on highways, that the Highways Authority have no objections to the proposal. Throughout the course of the application, additional details concerning visibility, traffic generation, collision data, gradients at the site access, and drainage have all been submitted and accepted by the Highways Authority. Condition 8 would also ensure that splays are maintained at all times. Paragraph 111 of the MPPF provides that development should only be prevented or refused on highway grounds if there would be an unacceptable impact on highway safety. The committee report concludes that one additional dwelling will not have any undue impacts on traffic in a village where traffic counts are actually very low. In summary, no evidence contradicting or otherwise undermining the officer's conclusions has been presented, and the proposal should be approved in line with paragraph 11D of the MPPF. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Members, you have 3 minutes to ask Mr. Halliwell if he's got anything. Councillor McCartney.
Thank you, Chairman. What's the distance at the closest point there in that top picture between the Dower House and the new development, please?
Yep, it's 11.2 metres or 36 feet away.
Other members? Councillor Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Always enjoy the way you're looking at me when you're making your sort of speeches. Unnerving at times. The scale to the existing buildings, you say basically there's very little difference in the scale. However, it's twice the size of the Dower House, and it is 4 times the size of Church Farmhouse. I don't consider that to be a small impact. The build, the design, I can't do this.
Sorry, Councillor Cross, could you put your microphone? Ah, thank you.
I've put my microphone on so the public can hear you through mine.
Sorry, I forgot where I was. The design of this build, I think, is very good. But unfortunately, in my view, in the position in that village at the top on that raised ground, it is overpowering to the other historic properties. And I believe, in my opinion, that you have possibly missed an opportunity to make more, not only of the architecture of the village, but of that particular site. For my own interest, have you taken your plans? Had you taken your plans to the parish council earlier? That was a question.
No, we didn't. If I may just say on scale, it may be useful to provide some additional context beyond the Dower House and beyond the cottages that you've mentioned as to the scale of the other adjacent listed properties in the village and how they do compare to the proposal property. And I think the easiest way to do so is to assess the gross external areas or the built footprints of the closest properties to the proposal site. And these properties dominate the current street scene, and they also dictate the prevailing character of Holygate Road. So the proposal dwelling has a gross external area of roughly 300 square metres, including the garage building. The Ridlington House property is located to the immediate east. This has a slightly greater gross external area, actually, at 340 square metres. It should be noted that that doesn't include several outbuildings that are associated with the Ridlington House. They're not included in that. The Dower House does have a smaller footprint at around 170 square metres, so not quite twice as large the proposal property. And next door to the west of the Dower House, the old rectory has a significant gross external area of 430 square metres. And that doesn't include numerous outbuildings. So I would disagree that the proposal site is considerably larger than the surrounding properties. So there's no denying that the proposal dwelling does have a slightly greater built footprint, not height, than Dower House. We've already discussed that we have reduced that ridge height, so it's not taller than the property either. But it is smaller than the two other closest listed properties found in the immediate vicinity of the site. And that's why I do agree with the officer's conclusion that it's absolutely correct, in my opinion, that it is commensurate when you look at those buildings with the scale of the adjacent listed buildings.
Thank you. We have now run out of time. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Mr. Halliwell, and apologies for queue jumping. Thank you. Members, over to you. I'm certainly not going to have a second crack, so Councillor Cross. You're entitled to.
I think I've said most of what has to be said. And when I say it was unfortunate that more thought was not put into this bill, you know, that mound upon which it is built, and I noted in the report that it is going to reduce in height, but I'm not too sure by how much. If the ground levels could be suitably reduced, it might help towards pacifying the concerns, the grave concerns of the residents of Ridlington, which is quite a special village. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Cross. Other members? Councillor McCartney.
Thanks, Chair. Question for the officers: Is Nick still with us, or are you taking over? Nick, one for Nick then. In assessing our effect on the neighbouring listed buildings, the Dower House and the Rectory, do we take into account loss of light and shadowing from there? Because it is very close to the Dower House, and is that a significant effect?
It's as the agent pointed out, it's 11 metres away from the Dower House and set to the front of it. If you look at the overall site plan, I don't know if we can find the correct slide, but
on the setted property.
in terms of loss of light and over dominance, it's to the southeast side of that property. So with the distance involved between the two, there may be some loss of sunlight early in the morning, but with the trees already being there, I don't think it's going to be a situation where it would have such an overbearing impact that you could say it was unacceptable.
Anything further, Councillor Carney? Thank you. Any other members, please? Councillor Cross. Of course.
What currently is the height of the removal of soil from that site, which has been agreed with the applicant, preferably in imperial?
Did you hear that question, Mr. Hodgett?
Yes, I did, Chairman. I've not got the figures in front of me. We can only go by the illustration that's now on the screen to show that the main house is set down somewhat. In terms of the overall height compared with the Dower House, it's comparable. It's not overly high compared with the properties around it. It is on a raised plateau, admittedly, but if you look at the street scene generally and accept that that house is set back quite a long way from the Hollygate Road frontage, I'm not sure lowering it any further would make a great deal of difference, really.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Someone is going to spend an awful lot of money building this rather nice property, and to take a bit more ground out on that, I presume it is ironstone ground up there, you know, it's not going to be to the detriment of the house, but it would certainly be to the benefit of those who will be viewing this new build and who may have lived in that village for very many years. It will go a long way to healing any angst that people may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cross. Any other sorry, Mr. Johnson.
Sorry, Chairman, just on that point, I know condition 3 refers to no development above ground level taking place until hard and soft landscaping, and it also includes ground levels to be agreed. It might be that we could amend that condition ever so slightly, just to make it more clear that we want to agree the precise height of the finished floor level prior to development taking place. I'm sure the developer would be comfortable with something like that.
Thank you. We're always pleased when you're in that mood. I would just add a couple of things. I said I wouldn't speak again, but on the Dower House as it now stands, the eastern part of it is a modern extension. It is not as it was originally. The other thing is that very prominent site in the village has been, in effect, an agricultural scrapyard for certainly my knowledge the past 40 years. And I think those are, again, considerations when you're looking at the impact on the heritage. So I'd welcome a proposal from members, please.
I recommend approval as per the officer's recommendation, with the condition levels as per Councillor Cross.
Do I have a seconder, please? I saw Councillor Payne fractionally first. So Councillor Oxley has proposed, Councillor Payne has seconded in accordance with the officer's report, with the additional comment that Mr. Johnson has taken on board about the levels. All those in favour, please.
Unanimous, Chair.
Unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You're very welcome to stay if you wish to, or anybody else who's come for the Ridlington thing, but I'll just allow a minute for people to leave if they wish to. Thank you. So we now move on to the Ketton application, and over to you again, Mr. Hoggett. Thank you.
Chairman, this is a site on the western side of Ketton. Some members on the committee will recall dealing with a duplicate of this application in July of last year, when it was refused planning permission for the single reason which is set out in the report. Next slide, please. So the site is that field that's contained between the housing on the north and eastern side, and the woodland on the south, and the field with the machinery marks in it to the northwest. Next slide. So it's an outline application for up to 75 units, which would include 30% affordable housing. The access would be from the northeast there off Bartles Hollow, which is off the Empingham Road. And there would be a pedestrian link through onto Park Road down there that you can see on the southeast corner. Most of the land to the southwest adjoining the Spinney would become public open space. And the land down on the northwest corner would become the surface water balancing area behind the properties on Bartles Hollow. Next slide, please. So this is a view from Bartles Hollow looking up into the application site, and you can see the woodland that forms the far boundary in the distance and the back of properties on Timbergate Road there on the left-hand side. Next slide. That's just a closer view really of the previous one. Next slide. This is the top of Park Road, and the application site is beyond those two large trees, and there would be a pedestrian cycle link onto Park Road from the application site in that corner. Next slide. Next slide, please.
Yeah. Nick, I think we lost you for a second, but we can hear you again now.
Okay, next slide then, please. Right, this is a view looking down sort of from the rear of where the previous one was taken, looking down Park Road towards the Luffenham Road at the bottom end. Next slide. Next slide. Can you still hear me?
Sorry, Nick, we lost you again. Can you just repeat that part?
Just next slide, please. This is a view from the top of Park Road where the footpath would come through, looking back down towards the properties on Bartles Hollow where the access would be. Next slide, please. So members will recall that this application was refused for that one single reason last year, whereby at the time we considered that we could demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. That decision has gone to appeal, although the appeal's not live yet, and it will be debated on that one single issue because there weren't any other reasons for refusal. As part of that appeal, the council would have to prepare a statement of common ground, which would inevitably have to include that we can no longer have a 5-year housing land supply. And on that basis, there are no reasons for refusing the application this time round, because that is a critical change in circumstances since the last application. And paragraph 11D, as it says there, carries significant weight as a material consideration when we are in this position. So in terms of the design, amenity, access, ecology, archaeology, and all the other issues that were considered last time, there's been no change to those which you considered were acceptable last time. And it really is only the change in policy that you need to consider this time round. I'm just going to the next slide. I think there's anything there we've not covered. I don't think so, no. No, so that there's no technical objections. The lack of 5-year land supply is critical, and I think officers now feel that we have no option but to recommend refusal, recommend approval this time round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodgett. We now move on to the delegation, and I have got, sorry, I'm just looking at my brief. I've got Lane, thank you, member of the public who's opposed. Thank you, Mr. Lane, if you'd like to come forward. And again, you've got 3 minutes, but I won't be too tight on the exact timing, but if you could keep it more or less there, and then 3 minutes for questions. So when you're ready, thank you very much.
I'd like to give longer, but I've tried to control it to 3 minutes. And just get set up. I am Graham Lane from Bartles Hollow, Ketton, one of 53 respondents opposed to the development. Main objections are traffic and flooding. Traffic. The single access point off Bartles Hollow is on a sloping 90-degree bend, navigation of which results in most traffic ending up on the opposite side of the road. The bend is particularly dangerous in winter conditions when there is a high risk of skidding, and vehicles, including emergency vehicles, have found it impassable. Winter conditions will have a greater impact on the new development roads as they are on steeper gradients. Councillor Brown has been advised of these issues, and he in turn has contacted Highways and Planning for a site visit and response for this meeting. We also need to highlight that the green space crossed by the access road is a safe play area at the moment, used regularly by children. The developer's traffic assessment of 45 peak time vehicle movements is based on key services being closer to Ketton than they are. We have a limited bus service, which is unsuitable for commuting, and other key services are 4 or more miles away. Car journeys to schools away from the village will also increase as Ketton School is full. And RCC have advised that the shortfall can be met by places being available around Casterton. This increase in traffic will have a huge impact on road safety, particularly at school times. RCC's Highways Department, however, appear to consider this is not an issue as there is no record of serious accidents to date. And now to flood risk. Bartles Hollow is in a high-risk surface water flood zone, as identified by the government's Flood Warning Information Service. Properties in the Park Road and Timbergate areas also suffer from similar flooding. Properties on Bartles Hollow were flooded on the 23rd of December 2020. This has not been referenced in this new application, even though the flood was captured on video and shared with RCC and the developer through Councillor Brown. The planned development includes an attenuation pond, as been mentioned. However, this is located above the lowest point of the site, so its effectiveness needs to be verified. RCC, the Environmental Health Team, on behalf of Public Protection, has also recommended that a phase 2 intrusive flood risk investigation is undertaken. This was not requested in the first planning application. And just one final point. The developers attended a public meeting in Ketton last Thursday, 10th of February. They stated that on completion of this development, responsibility for these and other risks would lie with RCC. Ketton residents would like to be assured that that RCC will accept these risks for this development and the other similar developments in the village, which you know is numerous now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lane. Members, you have 3 minutes to ask Mr. Lane any questions. Councillor Cross.
Car journeys, and I've seen the numbers in here. Would you say they are an underestimate?
Definitely. With 75 properties, it's likely there's going to be 150 vehicles on there. I live opposite that green area, and I watch traffic regularly going up and down the road. In fact, a group of neighbours have a coffee morning every Friday, so we got a good impression over an hour of how much traffic's flowing at an even quiet period of time. And as I say, with the number of vehicle movements up and down at that time, it's far greater at peak times.
Thank you very much indeed.
Any other members? Councillor Gordon Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask about the geometry of the junction at Bartles Hollow? I noted on slide number 5, I think it was, which was the photograph looking towards the site from Bartles Hollow. So it's looking west. No, next one. I think it's another one down. Carry on, carry on. Next one, next one. Oh, it wasn't.
Reference to the bend.
Yeah, reference to the dip.
If you go back, that one.
That one, that's probably it. Yeah, I noticed that that land falls away down into the bottom there, where you then can go down to Northwick Road. Is that blind as you come up towards it right now? Is that a blind corner?
It is. You can see when you go beyond Wixley Road is the road up to the right. Beyond the second, I did an assessment, and the drop away from that point there to the bottom of the bend to the first house is not far off 5 metres. It does drop round to the left, hence the reason why it's a problem in winter conditions. I've been out there clearing snow, and I am a snow warden for the village, so it's dangerous, particularly winter. But yes, it's a blind corner looking around there. The end house has got a wooden fence, so it's difficult to see, and people approach that corner not realising how steep and how much it falls away.
Okay. Can I also ask, if you were travelling from your house, which I believe is on the right-hand side here, to the west, going towards, say, Luffenham and Uppingham, which roads would you take out of the development?
Historically, I've lived there for 20 years. I tend to go over. I'm finding it more and more the case that I avoid opening a road because of the traffic flows along there are increasing. And dare I say, with 2 other developments up for consideration along there, it's a no-go area.
So would you use Northwick Road
I would
and out onto Luffenham Road?
Although that in itself is dangerous because, sorry, there are farm vehicles have started using that to avoid the crossroads as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are in fact out of time, so I couldn't see anybody else indicating. So thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lane. And if I can ask Sinclair Rogers to come forward on behalf of Ketton Parish Council, please. The same rules apply. 3 minutes and 3 minutes for questions. And when you're ready, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sinclair Rogers, Ketton Parish Council. The old Rutland local plan wanted more affordable homes and few houses outside the planned limits of development. The nullification of this local plan and the neighbourhood plan results in Ketton facing an accumulation of up to 270 new houses and 500 additional cars in a village where parking is already difficult, the school is almost full, and there is woeful public transport. Ketton is under attack from housing developers. The present recommendation for 75 houses says this application is acceptable on policy grounds on the basis the council does not have a 5-year land supply. Little or no attention is paid to the number of new houses coming to Ketton. The sites in Ketton, some with planning permission, others on their way, will supply about 40% of Rutland's 5-year housing requirement from just 5% of its population. This is inequality. The imbalance must be obvious to all. We consider that the haste to approve has barely allowed full consideration of the many objections, and we ask if the council can demonstrate that due diligence was properly completed. The County Council offers secret pre-app discussions with developers to sort out issues such as access, drainage, flood risks, types of houses. Then many of these issues are signed off. We ask, will public utilities be able to meet future needs? There is already a lamentable record of building control in the village. The council does too little for its residents. Residents who object are on their own. No cosy pre-app for them. To the people of Ketton, it appears that this authority is the one that likes to say yes to developers and no to residents. The people of Ketton have lost confidence in the County Council and believe that it does not act in a fair manner. The needs of its residents are not paramount. It has sacrificed the well-being of residents of Ketton and its landscape on the altar of county-wide housing numbers.
Thank you very much. Members, you have the opportunity to ask questions. I saw Councillor Andrew Brown first, Councillor Payne second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for that. You mentioned secret discussions between the council and developers. Have you got any evidence of that for us, please?
We have the evidence that the only way that the Manor Green pre-app was able to be seen by members of Ketton was through the Freedom of Information Act.
Councillor
well, I'm not familiar with that, so no, I can't comment on that.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, as members will know, pre-application discussions are usually considered to be commercially sensitive and are not made public. However, if a freedom of information request is made, then there are only certain exemptions that can be considered when we can't disclose that information. So our process is to go through the requirements, the legal requirements for an FOI. In the interests of the Manor Green one, it was considered that there wasn't anything particularly commercially sensitive in it because the applicants had put the information on a website of their own making, and therefore it was released. Had that information not been available online, then the likelihood is that we would not have been able to release it, as it would have been classed as commercially sensitive. We do not hold secretive meetings with applicants, but we do offer a pre-application advice service where applicants, in line with government guidance, that we offer an ability for applicants to come and talk to us about issues, and we will liaise with relevant consultees, including the Environment Agency, Highways, flood risk, etc., Lead Flood Authority, and seek to address some of those concerns prior to an application coming in. But then those comments are then fully assessed as part of the application, and obviously a report's presented to members today with those consultee replies, and members obviously debate at the meeting tonight. Thank you, Chairman.
I'm getting nods on my right from the legal officer as well. Councillor Payne.
Thank you, Chair. Could you describe Sinclair, please, for people that don't know Ketton? What sort of services Ketton provides and the size of its community? Thank you.
The village has about 2,000 population. We have one shop, one school that is almost all full, one pub, no doctor's surgery, very little police presence, and a bus service which is ridiculously poor. Developers have to put down how distant the bus stop is from the entrance of their development. What they don't say is that people could starve to death waiting for a bus to come. So we are called a service centre, but we have very few services available. We will be a car-based village.
Do you wish to come back, Councillor Payne?
And obviously Sinclair, sorry, don't want to put words in your mouth, but there's another 270 houses to go into the community on top of those services. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rogers, thank you for what you've already said. But just to add on to what our head development officer has said, Rutland County Council, the Planning Department encourage all developers of land to engage with their local community. And that was stated at the previous planning meeting. What concerns me about this development in Ketton is healthy living. Are the people who may live in this proposed development going to be able to access medical services?
Yes, by car. To go for a doctor's appointment in Empingham, the nearest doctor's surgery within Rutland is a 3-hour journey by public transport. One cannot get from Ketton to the county town of Oakham by public transport.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, will there be enough doctors to look after the number of people that may end up living in Ketton?
If I may say so, sir, that is a very good question, and it would appear no one has the answer.
But it is part of our duty to promote healthy living as councillors. If I may, Mr. Chairman, or we run out.
That's another question.
Yeah. We apparently have to meet the challenge of climate change. Flooding, and it's already been alluded to that there is flooding already in this particular area of development. Is it serious enough to be of concern?
It is indeed, sir. Not only flooding, but also sewage, and the difficulties that there will be in draining all the new developments that are likely to come. Almost all of them are above the level of the high street, and therefore will not be able easily to join the existing river courses.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed for your submission. And I'll now ask Claire Clark, the agent, to come forward, please. Again, I'm sure you're aware of the rules and standing orders. 3 minutes and 3 minutes for questions when you're ready.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm here on behalf of Vistry Group, the applicant. The site before you this evening adjoins the sustainable village of Ketton. It's one of the county's identified local service centres, and it benefits from a range of services and facilities. The proposed site is well related to the village. It will provide a mix of homes, including 23 affordable homes within walking distance of the village centre. The council itself has identified this site as a suitable location for development, including it as a potential housing allocation in the first draft of the local plan consulted on in 2017. It was shortlisted from over 150 sites, having been assessed against a range of criteria by the council's officers. As you've heard from your officers this evening, the council currently has a substantial housing land shortfall, and there's no prospect of that shortfall being met through the new local plan for the foreseeable future. The tilted balance is therefore in play, and the national framework states that planning permission should be granted unless there are adverse impacts of doing so that significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. There have been no significant or demonstrable impacts identified, and there have been no objections from key statutory consultees. The committee considered the same proposal last year and concluded that there were no other reasons for refusal other than at the time the council had sufficient supply of homes, and the proposals were otherwise found to be technically sound. There is now only 3.5 years housing land supply in the county, and the shortfall of 200 homes, and this application provides a sustainable means to meet that shortfall. This is a well-considered scheme, will provide much needed housing while also providing around half the site for public open space. The scheme will also deliver a biodiversity net gain and provide an opportunity to control surface water runoff by introducing a drainage scheme that directs water into a basin away from the lowest part of the site. A community infrastructure levy payment will also contribute to necessary infrastructure, including school places and doctors. This evening, approve this application subject to proposed conditions and section 106 agreement. Thank you.
Very much. Members. Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Could you explain how we're getting, or who's going to be in control? Not sure who's
responsible for it.
Thank you, councillor. Yeah, I think this is a really useful thing to go through actually. So the proposed drainage scheme would introduce swales on the site, which are shallow drainage channels that would push the water to the basin, so control the runoff. Basically, at the moment, it runs off to the lowest point in the site and it isn't controlled. So there'd be an opportunity to control it with swales, possibly use dams along the way to slow that infiltration process further. The water then would then be held in a basin in a part of the site that has good permeability. It would spread the water over a wide floor area and would only actually fill up with water when there's been very heavy rainfall. So this will in effect bring some betterment to the residents around the site and reduce the risk of surface water flooding, which is known and has been used to inform the proposed drainage scheme, which would be dealt with through reserved matters in terms of the details of that scheme. Insofar as it would reduce the surface water flooding that they're currently experiencing, because the water would be controlled on the site and released through infiltration in a slower, more controlled way than it is currently.
Yes, you do.
Will the actual site, the plans there, mirror the rest of the site regarding roads and everything else? Because if my memory is right, and I've seen some of the photographs, the roads around the estate are quite wide and give nice access for people to get into the houses and everything, and without parking on the roads and all that sort of thing, which we've seen in Oakham, where they've built narrow roads and the park on the sides on the pavements, nobody can get by or do anything. But the last thing we want to do is to see something like that built there.
Yeah, thank you, councillor. So the detail of the width of the roads and the layout of the houses and the parking provision would all be dealt with through a reserved matters application that would follow this, and certainly all of that you know, really useful feedback from yourself and engagement with residents would be used to help inform that process.
Thank you.
I've got four members waiting. I do intend to give you time to answer those questions. I know we're running slightly over time. I've got first one, Councillor Gordon-Brown, then Councillor Oxley, Councillor Batesby, Councillor Beggy, and then Councillor Cross. I've now got 5. So in that order, please, Councillor Gordon-Brown.
I shall keep my questions short, Chair. Can I ask just how far is it from the centre of this development to the shop in walking distance?
It's a 15-minute walk.
It's about 1.2 kilometres, and it's very steep uphill, is it not? The same distance almost to the school. Would you want to take a toddler up and down to that? A 5-year-old walking back and forward every day?
From personal experience, yes. I walk my children to school, and I know most parents enjoy that opportunity to avoid the traffic jams that do occur around school. So yeah, I think you know, that would be something I would personally do. But it's about choice, and there would be that opportunity to be able to walk your children to school if you wanted to. Right.
Obviously, a very young, active young lady. Can I ask about the roads on the site? They look as though they are not conventional tarmac roads. Are they going to be a different design, or?
That would all be dealt with through the reserved matters application, so none of that's fixed at this stage.
Okay, so will they be adopted by the county council?
That would be the intention, yeah.
Right, so the roads be adopted, the sewers be adopted, the lighting be adopted, but the residents would still have to pay for the maintenance of the drainage and also the maintenance of the playing area. Is that correct? Anything else they're going to have to pay for?
So yeah, it'd be the maintenance of the open space, and the swales and basin would form part of that open space. The drainage system would be part of that management system.
I've got Councillor Oxley next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I remember this application very well. The last time it came to this committee, and it wasn't my memory of it wasn't actually specifically the fact that we had a 5-year housing supply. There were very real concerns about flooding, water running off of that field into Bartles Hollow. And that was, I remember the photograph that we had looking up into the site. And that was actually the picture that we ended on while we were deliberating. So it wasn't just about the fact we had a 5-year supply, it was about the flooding. And I would like to ask the lady, what is the difference between the application we're looking at tonight and the application we refused last year with regards to flooding?
There's been no change. So the drainage scheme was as proposed at that stage.
And one other question, would it be possible for the attenuation pond to actually be lower? We had a presentation to say that it's actually not the lowest point of the site. So would it be possible to have it at a lower point so it actually does absorb more water?
So there was some intrusive site investigations done, and that's the most permeable part of the site. And actually holding it further up means that it doesn't get to those properties, into that lowest part of the site, which is where the problem occurs. So from a drainage point of view, it's better to hold the water slightly higher and then allow it to infiltrate into the ground at a slower pace, and therefore not affecting properties.
One last question. Why did you go for Bartle Hollow rather than Park Road?
So this was a number of options were looked at, and this was found to be the most appropriate route, and that's been supported by the Highways Authority.
Councillor Blanksby. Could we have your microphone on, unless it makes a horrible noise?
Yes, it's the same question about the parks and open spaces. We've had trouble before about putting it into maintenance companies, because what you didn't say is that the residents will pay for the maintenance. That's what it is. It's the resident that pays for the maintenance for public parks and open spaces and your flood actuation ponds. So the residents will actually be paying for it.
That's correct. The residents of the new development would pay towards a management company. It used to be the case that open spaces were adopted by councils or parish councils, and that's no longer something that's supported, and so this is the alternative for that.
Councillor Beggy.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions or comments, really. One of them was about highways, and my learned friend Mr. Oxley just pointed this out as well, about the difference between Bartle Hollow and Park Road. Why can't there be 2 access points? Because surely that would alleviate a lot of the ingress and egress of traffic through the site. It's, to me, just absolute common sense. If you try and funnel everything through one small point, you're going to get a pinch point. If you have 2 access points, you're going to alleviate that problem. Is question 1.
So the secondary access wasn't included because it wasn't necessary to make the access into the site safe, and that's been something we've discussed with the local highway authority and on the advice of our transport consultants, and the highway authority haven't raised any objection to the single access from a capacity or from a safety ground.
My question was, though, do you not think it would be better and easier to have 2 access points to reduce it?
That's not what we've proposed on this site based on the evidence that we've had.
Okay. I'll leave members to decide on that point. The green access space, this may be a question actually for Justin. Is there any protection on that to save that becoming future land for development?
From Vistry Homes' point of view, there's no intention for that to come forward for housing, and it would be up for the local authority to identify it as a green space in your local plan, and that would provide that protection.
Could I just ask that for Justin, or do I wait for debate, Chair, on that question?
Mr. Johnson, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it could be done through the section 106, but again, it could be done as part of the local plan application that was said, or also a neighbourhood plan allocation as well.
I just think some protection would maybe appropriate for that. My other questions, I think, are for the debate as opposed to the developer. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cross.
Mrs. Clark.
Mrs. Clark, I'm deaf. Got the right first letter anyway. Thank you very much for what you said already. You mentioned that this application has come forward purely because we have a housing shortfall in Rutland. But you are aware that over so many years, we have always exceeded any allocation for building in Rutland through the due diligence of our planning officers and the great oversight of councillors sitting on this planning committee. And furthermore, I believe that you should maintain your going to the what's it?
Could you come to your question, Councillor Cross, please?
What? The inspector? Yes. So will you continue with your application to the inspector to go through your last year's application?
And thank you, Councillor. I think just to say first that we haven't only brought it to you because of the lack of 5-year supply. We brought it to you last year when you did have a 5-year supply. We think it's a good site and a good opportunity for housing development. If the site's permitted this evening, then we would withdraw the appeal. But if the application is refused, then we'll take a view on continuing with that appeal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, members. We have rather run over time on that, but I felt it was very important that if any member had a question to ask the agent, it should be asked. Thank you very much, Mrs. Clark. Thank you. So we now move into the debate itself, and I'm giving Councillor Gordon Brown, Councillor Payne the opportunity to come in first on this. Councillor Payne.
Thank you. I know that my colleague here has been through his manuals and pulled out all the technical argument. But from my point of view, there have been 3 major applications approved in the last 4 months for Ketton. This is another one on top of that, and there are another 3 on top of that in the pipeline as well, making 257 houses, which makes I think the village of Ketton no longer a sustainable village. It just doesn't have the facilities and infrastructure to support this amount of housing. So I know Gordon's got a strong argument as to why the village is no longer sustainable in that context.
Thank you, Chair. The question I have tonight is, where do I start? That's the challenge I have. Both Councillor Payne and I have had extensive representation from residents, not just of the area adjoining this site, but the whole of Ketton. There are 5 issues, in fact, with the application, which I'd like members to consider this evening. First of all, the officer's suggestion that we should approve it just because of paragraph 11 of the MPPF. We should ignore everything else. 2, the overdevelopment in Ketton. 3, highway safety. 4, the sustainable location. And 5, the liability we have provided to purchasers of these houses. Let's deal with the idea that just because on this occasion, when the application came forward for this site, we rejected it on the grounds that it was outside the plans of development when we had the draft local plan going to the inspector, and therefore it was contrary to that plan. It appears that because we didn't give other reasons for objection, the officers are suggesting we cannot raise them now. I personally disagree with that view. We accepted the officers' very specific advice in July on face value, as we normally do. And I certainly didn't realise at that time we should have added more objections to that refusal. If that's the case, then members, let's remember that for the future, so that we don't fall into that position. Not only that, but the circumstances have changed since last July. Last year, not just for the better, but for the worse. The draft local plan has been withdrawn, but there's also the imperative of dealing with the climate change, which is certainly uppermost in many people's minds. And truly sustainable communities is uppermost in the whole country's mind, although it's not the case of the developer in this particular case, who, by the way, has a turnover of £2 billion per annum and a net return of 7% last year in a bad year. It may be that the officers have obtained legal advice on this matter, in which case I would ask that we go into exempt session to receive such advice, as it would be legally privileged. So my first question is, do we have legal advice on this matter, as stated by the officers, and the implications if members were minded to refuse this application this evening? Now, moving on to the overdevelopment of Ketton, I'm going to go through the whole point, if you don't mind, Chair, rather than stopping and answering each point. Moving on to the overdevelopment of Ketton, as my colleague, Councillor Payne, has pointed out, we only have 1,176 dwellings already in Ketton. 2/3 of those are 3-bedroom or less. I think it's an important point to remember in the future. Members have already approved 3 sites in Ketton in the last few months, 50 homes at the Crescent, 21 homes at Chaterfield, and 15 homes just last month at Home Farm. This was the full allocation for Ketton through to 2035 in the withdrawn local plan, these houses. In addition to the application in front of you this evening, there are 3 further live applications with the Planning Department coming forward for determination. Wootton Close on Empingham Road, 36 homes. Manor Green, just off Empingham Road, 41 homes. And Luffenham Road, 16 homes. Now, Luffenham Road application is liable to be decided by delegated decision, as it's within the plan limits of development, it's an infill site that meets all the criteria that one would normally expect. And I think the officer is generally minded towards approval of that site, although subject to obviously final considerations of all the points and a request from Councillor Payne and myself regarding some highways matters. So Ketton has approvals for 86 homes and applications for a further 168 homes, including this application. At what point should members say, hang on a minute, this is overdevelopment and having an adverse and severe adverse impact on our community? I am glad, however, that Mr. Hodgett acknowledges that paragraph 11D applies. And my question to the officers, and probably to our barrister in this case, does MPPF paragraph 11D section 2 apply in this case, and that approved taken as a whole? Should we not take all these developments in the round rather than piecemeal? That's a question I ask, and a question I ask for some legal advice on. You'll notice that I mentioned the issue of electricity in the question to officers. I have to say I'm not happy with that reply, as particularly as appeared now in 2 different documents to the scrutiny panel just last week, where it clearly said that civil money was required towards providing the electricity supply to Ketton just for the houses that we've already approved, not for any additional houses. And that was in the infrastructure delivery plan, which was presented alongside the withdrawn local plan. So I'm concerned about the lack of capacity of electrical supply, and suggested in the addendum that that's not material planning consideration. Well, tell the residents of Ketton that when we don't have any electricity in the village, when we have excess demand, particularly from the new requirement, as members will recall, for every house, and this will apply to this development, all other developments now, that require a charger, an electrical charger on every house as of the middle of this year. The NPPF is clear, I believe, in terms that infrastructure should be delivered along with the development and not after. Can we really say that is not our problem, that is not a material planning consideration? Developers can purchase electrical supply in advance. I know this because I negotiated with St George's, the MOD and Western Power on that matter. So what would the impact of a further 75 homes in Ketton, in addition to those we've already approved? Well, you've already heard from the excellent presentation from the Parish Council and others. Ketton is under pressure. The school's at 97% capacity. We have a small shop in the centre of the village with a parking for about 3 cars at the best. And by the way, remember, members, that you approved an application at the behind the shop, which will limit that parking even further. There's only one pub, extremely small, and with no beer garden. That's quite important these days. There are no cafes, no restaurants in the village. There's no car parking in the centre of the village whatsoever. And we already have very significant parking issues outside the shop, as I've mentioned, and certainly Councillor Payne's been very active in trying to deal with the parking outside the school, which continues to be a problem and now affects Manor Green, having put double white yellow lines in the centre of the village. As Mr. Rogers pointed out, there is no surgery close to Ketton, having the surgery being closed by the CCG 3 years ago. The closest is either Imping or Stamford. Stamford's in special measures, is now undergoing a major CQC examination. The secondary schools are in Uppingham and Casterton, again travelling far. Members, Ketton is struggling already with the addition of 75 homes on top of that already approved. Do you consider it can accommodate 25% growth in the next 3 years? Moving on to highway safety. It's unfortunate there's not been a site visit. I don't know if, Julie, you've been to site and visit. You have been to site. Thank you very much. We do appreciate that. We did ask for that. But I know that the Bartles Hollow quite well, as I mentioned earlier. And Mr. Mapstone, a resident, has already stated in his response that the transport statement is completely irrelevant in context of sight lines and ignores the complexity of the proposed 3-dimensional junction. And the point I raised with one of the representatives from the village is that, of course, it's a blind corner coming from the going west. In the latest update from ADC on behalf of Ministry, if you go to 5.1, paragraph 5.1, it states that in addition, some trips would route south along Bartles Hollow and onto Northwick Road to reach Empingham Road South. That's a very important point as a question I asked. Now it says in the same document, equally, along the 4 routes, there would be increase of less than 32A movements on all routes, and such increases would not be material. Now that is on the basis that they are equally spaced. Now, I'm sorry that averages mean that is the average and will happen once in 100 times. The problem you've got is what happens when it's not the average and it's much greater. And I think we've already heard this evening that the tractors are already using Northwick Road to avoid the Empingham Junction. These are things that are probably not seen during the one day that the ADCs come along to check the number of vehicles travelling. So to me, the problem is what the technical basis consultants believe in terms of equal distribution. What about the safety implications? I travelled down Northwick Road just last week, and there were parked cars down that road, and the refuse vehicle was struggling to get past. I certainly couldn't get past the refuse vehicle. Maybe the highways engineer can explain the science behind these assumptions. My 4th point is this truly a sustainable site? How will it reduce car journeys? Because that's the objective, surely, for any sustainable site, not to increase car journeys, but to reduce them. Yes, there's a bus service that goes to Stamford, but it doesn't go to Oakham, as Mr. Rogers pointed out. It certainly doesn't go to Peterborough. And it only runs every 2 hours, which is maybe fine for shopping, but not for employment in those centres. I think Mr. Rogers pointed out the trip to Empingham is a 3-hour round trip to the surgery there. And that's lucky if you get the right appointment time in terms of the bus times. The trip to Stamford's even worse. You've got a 4-hour round trip and a walk of 2 miles for residents between the bus station and the surgery, a round trip of that. And yes, there's a shop in the village, but that's also a mile away. And I was very pleased to hear Mrs. Clark would walk back and forward to that with her toddler. But I question that would happen. Would you expect residents to walk 2 miles for a pint of milk to the local shop when they run out? They would get the car. Of course they would. And that's part of the problem we have. Yes, there's limited employment in Ketton, but there's not sufficient for 300 residents. So where are they going to travel to for employment? There is no allocated site in Ketton for further employment. They're now all used up. And so it'd be Stamford, Peterborough, Oakham, Uppingham and Corby, all of which themselves are sustainable locations, but getting there is not a sustainable method. The only route really is by car. Finally, I was glad to hear Mrs. Clark saying that liability for residents will not include the roads or the sewage or the lighting. However, I note that they're going to be paying for the SUDs, the sustainable drainage and the play areas, which is an additional cost, particularly for the affordable homes, could be an issue. So I could go on all night probably, but I won't bore you. But Mr. Rogers did point out the drainage and the flooding and the slope of the site. The neighbourhood plan has not been raised. And of course, the neighbourhood plan is now out for its first consultation. And it does make comment about the preference for not building on outside the plan limits development. So I would like to hear what other members say before I come back with maybe some final points, Chair, on the application. Thank you.
Other members, Councillor Dale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I ask Mr. Johnson, how's the site going to be accessed with the lorries and all the development vehicles that's going to be there? Surely it's not going to go through Birtles Hollow.
Chairman, I think the likelihood is that would be the proposed construction route, but there would be a requirement for a construction management plan, so the details we can have control over the precise routing for vehicles for construction and how compounds are done, those sorts of things.
Can I come back, Mr. Chairman? How long do we think the development is going to take? A rough guess.
I would have thought a couple of years to build out.
That's what I would have thought, yeah. And it's going to cause a lot of stress to the residents around there, having vehicles going by there, lorries taking all the materials there every day. I'm inclined not to vote for this at the moment, Mr. Chairman, unless we can find a different access for the development vehicles. I think it's going to be put too much stress on the people around and about there. We're talking about the roads, the amount of traffic on the roads there now. And I think when you get all those vehicles on there, it's not going to be very nice to be living down there.
I've got Councillor Oxley, then Councillor Beggy, and then Councillor Andrew Brown. Councillor Oxley.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as mentioned earlier, I remember very well this application the last time it came to this committee. And we did have good reasons for refusing it, beyond the fact that at the time we had a 5-year land supply. As I mentioned earlier, I have very real concerns about flooding. I asked the agent what difference there was between last year's application and this year's application, and she said none whatsoever. So the reasons that I gave last year for refusing it, supporting the refusal, haven't changed, in my opinion. Although having heard from Councillor Brown, we do have actually further extenuating circumstances to refuse it, given the amount of pressure that is on Ketton now from the applications which we have passed in the past 6 months. And I can't understand why every single, the reason given for us to allow the application is that we don't have a 5-year housing supply. And are we going to see that on every single planning application that comes to this committee? I mean, what is happening to all the planning applications that we gave permission to and which are in the pipeline and which are going to be built at the moment? We have a lot of houses which are going to be on stream soon. Whilst I appreciate we might not have enough in 4 years' time or 3 years' time, and I know that developers will take advantage of it, but we must look at every single application, and I've said this before, on their own merits. That is critical, and we cannot be pushed onwards, ever onwards, into giving permission to applications simply because we don't have a local plan. And whilst I appreciate that that is an issue, we should also try and give some credence to what we actually have in the pot at the moment. Now, I really do think that Ketton is not a sustainable location for good reason, that we have already given permission for sufficient housing in Ketton for the next how many years? And what happens if we get an application for 100 houses in next year in Ketton? What happens then? Will we have to give permission to that as well? And as I say, last year, we refused it for a number of reasons. And as I say, my main concern was the slope and the runoff from that slope, highways access into the surrounding area, outside the plan limits of development. Those are all good reasons for refusal. And in my opinion, that hasn't changed. So I'll wait to hear what everybody else has to say. And we mustn't also forget the fact that there is currently the application which came in last year, which we refused, which has gone to appeal, that is still being decided. And so I am minded to say, well, perhaps we should just allow that application to go to appeal and see what the inspector has to say. Because if we're being asked to give permission for the same one this evening, what's the difference between that one and this one, in my opinion?
Members, I'm just going to
frustration around the 5-year housing land supply issue and the presumption in favour in terms of paragraph 11D of the MPPF. And unfortunately, I have to say to members that officers' reports will fall back and will refer to that point. It is a significant material planning consideration. What I would say is that, as I think Councillor Brown raised earlier, point 2 of that paragraph is relevant in terms of, it does say that grant permission unless there are any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the framework. So it's not approve everything just because we don't have a 5-year housing land supply. You still have to consider the other policies in the MPPF, in particular those around sort of protecting listed buildings, open space, design, all those kinds of issues. But significant weight is in favour of approving them. Now, in terms of this application, as we've already said, and as members are aware, there is an appeal being held in abeyance, and I was at the meeting last time when it was debated at quite some length, and I think the issues around the highway safety and flood risk was raised at that time. However, at that point, officers did indicate at that time that there was no overriding evidence against the information that had been submitted and the specialist advice from Highways and Lead Flood Authority to warrant a reason for refusal on highway safety grounds or on drainage, for example. And that is why they were not included on the reason for refusal last time. So the only thing that has changed since the last application is the fact that we no longer have a 5-year housing land supply. And unfortunately, that is, again, a significant material consideration that the members will have to weigh up and debate. And the only thing that I would remind members of is that we have an appeal in the background that only has a 5-year housing land supply issue. Obviously, if this was to be refused for other grounds, then I'm sure those points would be raised at that appeal time. And like I say, what members need to consider is, do we have the evidence to back refusals up on those grounds? And professional advice is that in terms of flood risk and highway safety, the proposal is considered acceptable. I think the other thing that needs to be mentioned, and I totally understand the concerns around Ketton. The cumulative impact of developments is a material planning consideration and is something that members are entitled to weigh up, and as officers we have given consideration to. I'm sure my highways colleagues will be able to advise. I think there was an assessment of the cumulative impacts of a number of the other developments that have been referred to today. In terms of the highway impacts from this development, it did take into account the other developments that were going on in and around the area. And even taking those into account, it was concluded that highway safety wouldn't be sufficient for a reason for refusal. So they're all, I just wanted to make those points, but I do take on board the concerns that members have and residents of Ketton in terms of the amount of development that is coming forward in the area.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm bringing the legal.
I just wanted to add a little bit extra to what I concur with what Justin's just been saying to you, but there's two issues with regards to the appeal. Obviously, we can't bring new, we've said that there was one reason for refusal on that appeal, and we can't bring in new grounds at that point, because we start bringing in new grounds at this point. I mean, for one, you're going to be looking at costs, because they'll have created and put forward the appeal on that one ground and that one ground only. So I do want to air caution at that point that inspectors will obviously wanting it to proceed just purely on that basis. I think another point that you all have to take into consideration, you're all here obviously to look at the planning merits and to make determinations and to look at infrastructure within Rutland, and in a way it potentially could take this out of your hands if you put it into an inspector and it's an approved, and obviously you may not get the same conditions, you may not get the same control over the development, obviously if it's looked at in more detail this evening.
Very much indeed. I'm sure members have taken, and no, Councillor Cross, I realise that there are people who want to ask questions, but I'm going to take them in the order in which they indicated. I'm sorry, you'll have to come in order. The order I've got at the moment is Councillor Beggy, Councillor Andrew Brown, Councillor Abigail McCartney, Councillor Paul Brown, and Councillor William Cross. And I'm going to take them in the order that I saw them, and just to test your memory. Councillor Beggy.
Just 2 points of clarification, probably for Justin, really. One is about the appeal process and the 5-year landing supply, housing supply. My question one is, Cherie mentioned that we couldn't bring in other reasons for refusal, but I think that contradicts a little bit what you said, Justin, saying is that if we refused it on other grounds, they could be brought into the appeal. What is the fact? If we refuse this tonight, will those other areas for refusal be brought into consideration by the inspector? Would it be the original appeal based on one only?
I think there is a good chance that potentially that the applicant would ask for both this case and the other one to be considered potentially conjoined at the same time, in which case effectively the reasons for refusal on this would be added to the previous one, but an inspector will consider that we have an identical application that was refused only on 5-year housing land supply, And now we potentially add other reasons for refusal. And the thing that you would need to demonstrate is that there'd been a material change in circumstance to add those other reasons on. Otherwise, it would put us in a difficult position in terms of trying to defend an appeal on any additional grounds.
Thank you. Just on that one point, I think Councillor Gordon Brown mentioned about what legal advice had been taken on the 5-year housing supply. Could we just clarify that position?
In terms of from a development management position and in terms of this application, I'm not aware that we've taken any legal advice in terms of the 5-year housing land supply. I don't know what other policy colleagues may have taken in the background as part of the development plan process, but nothing in terms of this application.
Okay, thank you. It was an important question Gordon asked. So I was wanting clarification of that. My final one is not necessarily a question about what is the art of the possible. I still don't really believe in the sentiment about the highways and having one access and funneling everything through one area. Regardless of what highway tell you, common sense says that 2 accesses will split the amount of traffic and remove the nuisance value of that traffic. Is there any way that we can look to amend the application, or have we already got to a point where we've now gone too far because of the original refusal? Because I just think to alleviate some of the issues, common sense says have 2 accesses.
Through you, Chairman, I think it was a point that was considered by officers and highways colleagues as well, and I don't think we've got any objection to having 2 accesses from there. The issue is that we have to consider the application that's before us. I think there may have even been possibly discussions with highways who suggested two accesses, but the applicants have put forward a single access, and that's what we have to consider today. And whilst it may be preferable to have 2 accesses, the information from a highway safety point of view has demonstrated that a single access would be acceptable, and we don't have grounds to refuse it.
So our hands are tied on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Andrew Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've just looked back in my notes because I've got them in this book here from the meeting in July, and the reason that I voted against it was the fact that there's a 20-metre fall from one end of the site to another. It's about 70 feet, Councillor Cross. So it's huge. And to me, it seems obvious, as Councillor Begg has just said, about the 2 entrances. And listening to Councillor Payne's and Councillor Brown's comments, I really can't support this this development.
Councillor McCartney.
Thanks, Chairman. We don't very often get quite such moving representations from parish council chairmen. That was quite a statement that was made in Mr. Rogers' representation, and it was quite moving. I think Councillor Brown's quite right. One of the things that we do have to take into account is that, and it is a material consideration, as Justin's just said, is that circumstances have actually significantly changed since we last saw this application. We've had 3 more developments approved in that time. And Ketton Parish Council do seem to believe that pushes Ketton past its point of sustainability and the level at which it can cope with numbers of people and amount of traffic and parking and school places, people coming in and out of the shop. There's no parking really to speak of outside the pub. So I think that's something we've got to take into account. I think I've got 2 questions to the officers. How many years worth of supply do we have in the bank which has been approved recently but it's not currently finalised and therefore not counting towards our 5-year supply in terms of housing numbers? Is that a figure we've got?
So we're just over about 3.5 years. It's obviously not just done on what's been approved, but it's also the time frame for when it's built out as well.
Yeah. do we have a time frame on what will be built out that is currently approved?
In terms of what will be built out in the next 5-year period, we estimate that we've got 3.5 years housing supply.
Have we talked to the parish council about adopting this public open space? Are they interested in doing that? I mean, a lot aren't interested, but some parish councils are interested in adopting that rather than taking it through a management company.
It's not something that I'm aware that there have been any discussions. It might be a question more for the developer.
Thank you, Councillor McCartney.
And one last thing, and I think that's the access. I think it's daft not to have a second access. It's if this is going to be built, it's got to have 2 access points. I think if that's going to come forward as an amendment to the proposal, then I could perhaps support that.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, I would like to sort of address this point that is the mantra that keeps coming forward, that 11D is almost trumping every single application that comes up. I've done some research on this because this is going to come up twice tonight because of the situation that we're in. However, it's not the only paragraph in the NPPF. There are actually 217 others, all of which are required to be considered. Paragraph 2 actually states that all these paragraphs apply to every application where relevant. Not all of them constitute what is termed a major planning consideration, and the courts have been asked to provide guidance as to what does or does not amount to a major planning consideration. That's within the 217 that are on offer. The major case on this is called Stringer versus the Ministry of Housing, and the judge there said, in principle, it seems to me that any consideration relating to the use and development of land is capable of being a planning consideration itself. Whether a particular consideration within a broad class is material, in any given case will depend on the circumstances. That's not really helpful other than saying everything has to be considered. It is accepted that many of the paragraphs do have specific weight, such as 8, 11, and 20, but the NPP itself does not specify which paragraphs are of paramount importance, nor even which are more important than others. In the words of Tim Leader, who has been employed by this council to advise councillors, he said quite succinctly, it is up to councillors to weigh importance of the relevant paragraphs to the application to enable them to reach a planning decision. So it's not automatic. Further, Mr. Leader cited the case of North Somerset District Council, which has also had a plan that was well out of date, similar to our present circumstances, because we do have a valid plan. But nevertheless, had still succeeded by bringing into play other aspects of the NPPF in defeating 5 of their last 7 appeals concerning major residential developments heard before the planning inspectorate. Similarly, Mendip District Council has never even had a local plan and yet still succeeded against these on appeals. So the mantra does not automatically override all other paragraphs, and we have to bear that in mind. I'll reserve the rest of it for my other statement.
Councillor Cross.
Expert advice. I presume that the previous development received advice about flooding. It was put in place. There would be no flooding. However, history demonstrates that expert advice is not always correct. We sit here now with more expert advice to inform us that contingencies will be put in place to alleviate any flooding on this hillside. And I'm sorry, but I think we should seriously take such advice with much salt. Going back to the inspector, partly been answered. You know, we were advised that if we put further comments, this could be taken on board and cost the council far more. However, currently, the inspector will be looking at the case on the point that we had a local development plan in place, which we did at that particular time. And therefore, I could see the inspector upholding our side. I see a shaking head from a legal eagle, but being a pure layman, I see things very simplistically. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Cross. Is there any member who hasn't spoken? I have something that I wish to contribute, and then I'll ask Gordon Brown perhaps to speak before we go to the vote. If a bit, is there any other member who wants to come in at this point before I do? No. In that case, my own opinions on this, I do feel sympathy for the officers. I think that their hands are quite often tied. It's very difficult. We are not in that position, members. And I personally feel very strongly that we have at some point to make a stand. I feel it may be this evening. I would look at the cumulative effect on Ketton, which has already been mentioned. It does seem to me, members, it's almost like the sequential test when we were looking at sites for supermarkets in Oakham, that you have a desirable site and then a less desirable, etc., etc. Now here, I think it's chronological. It happens to be that this application is third in line, I think, or possibly fourth, depending which you're taking in. There may be three more to come. But the cumulative effect on Ketton is absolutely enormous. And if you look at the hierarchy and the plans that our predecessors, policies that our predecessors have kept for Rutland, that the main developments should be in the two market towns and then in a hierarchy. And we've already heard from both the parish council and the ward members that service centre it may be, but it's not exactly a service centre that luxuriates in a lot of facilities. On sustainability as well, both Councillor Gordon Brown and I sit on the Task and Finish group. Now, the last bit of information we had from the MFIG surgery, I think I'm right in saying, is that by the end of March, they will have an additional 2,500 patients because of the collapse of Lakeside and the dissatisfaction with some other. Now that's before a single house has been built on any of these applications. Now, and we've heard about the education, which is not quite so acute, but it's certainly barely adequate. In the parish council submission, I'm only going to very quickly pick out one point. The transport policy is one that the police already consider out of date, and they will take no notice of it when they're making their decisions. So again, source for the goose, source for the gander. If one policy is out of date and is disregarded, then perhaps others should be as well. But again, like other members who've already spoken, and Councillor Paul Brown put this very clearly, you come back to that paragraph on page 39, of your report. It is the paragraph 11D. Any adverse effects of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies. And if you look at page 48, which is the summary, on this basis, says our officer's report, we are turning it down. Sorry, we are pruning it the other way around. I think the basis is mistaken, personally. I think, and I do take Mr. Johnson's point earlier, has there been any material change? Now, I think we've got to be extremely careful how we approach this, should you be minded to refuse this evening. That material change, it seems to me, is demonstrable, is arguable. I know members with different expertise quite rightly bring that. You'll forgive me for a quotation. Awake, arise, or be forever fallen. And I'm sure somebody will point out to me that was Satan encouraging the fallen angels to get out of hell and go to heaven. I do not want to see this county, let alone this village, be committed to, I don't want to be too emotive about it, but I do feel very strongly about it, to a hell on earth because we did nothing. It may well be that the planning authority goes with the 5-year thing and overrules us. But if we don't make a stand at some point, we are simply nodding through an imposed policy. We are not having a say on it. I don't know about you members, but I don't want to be emasculated by some bureaucratic regulation. But I'll hand over to Councillor Gordon-Brown now.
Thank you, Chair. Just some points, not knowing which way the vote will go. I think it's important that we have identification of either conditions that may be supplementary if it's positive, and if negative, the reasons why that we're objecting to the proposal. If it's positive, I would suggest, and I'd now look very much towards our legal advice and Justin, in relation to a number of issues. One, I think there's a general feeling around the table tonight about the access to the site. And I think we would like that to be reviewed as part of the conditions, if that would be acceptable. I'm just looking, there's no shaking of heads.
Chairman, now I would just need to check, just bear with me, I just want to see whether it was a reserved matter. I'm thinking that access is considered at this stage. So I would suggest that if members are minded to approve subject to changes to the access, then I think we would have to potentially defer to go back and speak to the applicant about it. Because we can't just put on a condition to say we want 2 accesses.
I didn't say that. I said that we would review the position.
Yeah, I think the way to do that would be to defer.
Because there are other issues. It's not just a simple question of opening up Park Road. There are issues about that being a very straight road and the implications to the residents of Park Road. I didn't want to go into the detail. I'm just saying, if approved tonight, that as part of the conditions, we review that position to make sure that we have the best options in terms of access in the wider sense. So it's saying yes, but we want that just looked at.
We couldn't do that, as what Justice just
Yeah,
said.
I think we couldn't put it on as a condition. What members would have to do is defer it back to officers to discuss those options with the applicant and then bring it back to committee.
Can I just
Councillor Cost, on this point, yes, yes.
Members could refuse it for those grounds.
That is one ground that we could use on a list of grounds.
The only thing that I would say in that, in terms of the professional advice that you've had, is that there are no highways objections to the access, but yes, if members decide, having weighed everything in the balance, that they are concerned, then that would be acceptable.
So that would be one of our reasons.
Can I just add just a little legal point to that, is that what Justin's just been saying, that we can have the reasons for refusal, but we do have to be able to substantiate them. So it can't just be an opinion that we have, because obviously what will happen at appeal is things like highways, they will have their highway data, or they'll have their details. So we've got to be able to show that when we do there's going to be strong grounds of why you think that access there is not acceptable. So we've got to be able to back it up with some sort of substantial evidence.
The second issue was infrastructure, but that's much more difficult to define. But there is serious concerns over infrastructure. If this were to be approved tonight, how we can ensure that the developer ensures that infrastructure is in place before development takes place rather than afterwards. I'm thinking particularly of the electrical supply, which has been identified in the local plan. It's not something that's a figment of my imagination on this occasion. It's an actual limitation which has been identified. And I appreciate the response we had from the officers today. I'm just suggesting that as part of the development, there has to be a formal plan in place, condition to say there's a formal plan in place to deliver the electricity to Ketton before the houses go ahead.
Yeah, I think we could word up a condition that requires details to be submitted to confirm that that supply is provided prior to the development taking place. I'm sure we could word something to that effect.
Thank you. Those are the points on that side. On the other side, the issues which would be reasons for not approving it this evening would be the question of sustainability, given since we approved the previous, so we rejected the previous application, and now we've approved some 80 houses. That has had an impact on the sustainability of the village. This would be another step way beyond that and way beyond the withdrawn local plan. So that was a big and significant change. So I question the sustainability, not just in the short term, but long term. There's the question of the highways that my fellow councillor, Councillor Cross, pointed out, the accesses, that I think there was a comment from the highways engineer that, well, maybe 2 accesses would be acceptable. So we're not saying that's not a case, that there's a case for that. And then I think the big one is the cumulative effect on Ketton in particular, compared to the impact on the market towns. Currently, we're looking at a situation where virtually all development, any significant development, is in Ketton, and virtually none at this point in time is in the market towns. That may change later this evening, who knows. So those were the 3 key points that I put forward on that side. You could put forward the infrastructure as well as an issue, but that was part of the local plan. I'm not too sure whether that'd be appropriate. It may be that we, at the end of the day, delegate the final wording to the chair, along with the officers to finalise the wording if it were to be rejected this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Oxley.
I also would like to state that nothing has changed from the last time that we refused this application, beyond the fact that we don't have the 5-year supply. It is outside the planned limits of development, as it was. And the agent has have made Ketton unsustainable. So we may have rejected it because we already had a 5-year plan and it was outside plan limits of development. I believe we can reject it this evening because of the amount of development that has taken place in Ketton subsequent to the rejection of the local plan, which makes Ketton an unsustainable location. And I believe that should be added as well.
So, see, anyone else who would like to speak before we go to the vote? In that case, I'm looking for a proposal, please. I don't know if it's fair to go to the Councillor Gordon Brown.
Chairman, I propose that we refuse the application.
Thank you. And you had already outlined your three reasons, which I hope the officers have got. But if not, rather than I probably do need to do this publicly. So I'll take a seconder, please, for that. And that I saw Councillor Payne. I'll keep it within ward for the moment. And at this point, we do need, just if you wouldn't mind, reiterating the 3 points. Sorry, I think if you give a précis of them, Councillor Gordon Brown.
Yes, sorry, if I may, I just want to check that I've got them down.
You have already got them.
Thank you. So, I'm
Chair, they're also on the record, the recording that we've got this evening as well, for clarity.
Yeah. So I've got down here, obviously the comments about sustainability, given the as the previous refusal is more about good design and having 2 accesses rather than the single one, rather than a highway safety issue in there through the village. Yeah, so design. Okay.
Would have called you up had you been out of order.
And then obviously I've got the cumulative impact on Ketton with regards to the overall development that's taking place on there. And again, that links back into the sustainability arguments and
sorry,
the lack of infrastructure.
Legal officer.
Now, there was, there's been no mention of drainage in this, and I'm, as I've said before, we're proposing to add drainage as well.
Yeah, that would come under infrastructure.
No, evidence of flooding from the site and the floods. Yeah, so evidence of flooding off the site and oh, sorry. Take the mask off. Yes, evidence of flooding from the site into the surrounding area, which will be exacerbated by the tarmac and concrete that's being put down as opposed to a permeable surface of a field. And a field is much better at soaking up water than concrete. And that I made that point stridently last time, and that hasn't changed.
And Chairman, I will obviously refer this back to the relevant policies that are set out in page 39 of the report, and that members are having considered paragraph 11D and in particular point 2 of that outweighs the tilted balance in this case. So based on that, Chairman.
Right. We haven't actually taken the vote, so we have got reasons for it has been proposed and seconded. All those in favour of the proposal to refuse, please.
Unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, I would like to say to the representative of Ketton Parish Council, I hope we've disproved your assertion this evening that we do not actually listen to local opinion, but in fact, at times on your behalf, are prepared to challenge an imposed central policy. Thank you very much, members. Again, as I promised at the beginning, I will just have a brief adjournment. And if members would like to take a comfort break, I would like to start again at past, please. Thank you.
All right. You do, don't you? You don't make it easy for me.
No, nobody pretends.
No, and they don't.
Thank you very much, members. We will recommence and move to the Oakham application, which is number 3 on your list. So over to you, Mr. Hodgett. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The next slide, please. This is an application on the land to the west of Uppingham Road, as you can see on the plan there. It's contained by the railway line to the west and Uppingham Road to the east. To the north is the now almost complete Spinney Hill development, which you'll see from the report. Went through a similar phase to this one in that it was eventually allowed on appeal because we didn't have a 5-year housing land supply at that time. To the south of the site is an existing hedge that forms the boundary to the remaining farmland, and there is a farm access that you can see along the southern edge there. Next slide, please. This is turned around the other way just to get it in the screen, but it just gives a closer up view of the railway line, Uppingham Road on the top of the photograph there, and the properties on Spinney Hill that adjoin the northern boundary of the site. Next slide. This is a view from the southeast corner of the site where the balancing facility would be. So Uppingham Road is on the right hand side there behind the hedge underneath the number 4. To the left is the southern boundary adjacent to the farm track, and the far side is the boundary with the railway, and in the distance is the rear of the development on the edge of Spinney Hill. Next slide. And these are photographs also taken within the site. So the top one is closer to Spinney Hill within the application site, looking along to that rear northern boundary. The centre one is sort of to the left of the top picture, looking back with the Uppingham Road hedge on the left-hand side, and the railway would be over on the far right there. And then the bottom photograph is taken looking north with the railway boundary on the left-hand side, and again you can see the edge of the Spinney Hill, the western edge of the Spinney Hill development on the right-hand side of the photograph. Next slide. This is just a close-up again showing the northern edge of the application site, which is the green field, and it shows that landscape strip that was retained as part of the Spinney Hill development, which has been fenced off so that there's no sort of public access to it. Apart from for maintenance purposes. You'll see those 3 large trees at the top of the site there on the right hand side. There is a procedure being gone through at the moment to make a preservation order on those 3 trees, although I think there's been some debate as to whose land they actually sit on at the moment, but that is something that is being taken into account. Next slide. This plan just shows the nearest public footpath to the site, which runs across from Uppingham Road, and as you can see it crosses over the bypass and comes out on the corner near the church in Eggleton. Next slide. This is just a wider photograph that shows the bridleway that runs across the railway from Eggleton and runs across to Brook Road for much further to the south of the site. So those are the 2 nearest public rights of way. Next slide. This plan shows the conservation area boundary, which is in the brown line, and the plan limits to development, which is the black line, and again shows the site adjoining the plan limits to development for the southern side of Oakham. Next slide. Excuse me. This is a plan that showed the sort of evolution of the layout, showing the constraints and opportunities, and the sort of fundamental idea behind the layout, which is the sort of current way of developing to create these cluster blocks so that all houses are outward looking and you don't get rear elevations facing onto roads or to open spaces. Next slide. This is a sort of a plan that shows how the perimeter blocks work, and those purple buildings are buildings that effectively have dual facades that turn the corners, so you don't have a blank facade around the edge of one particular building. And then you've got the sort of landmark building locations where the blue stars are situated on the layout. Next slide. This shows the street hierarchy. So you've got the main primary street from the new access shown coming in blue, secondary street at the far end that forms a loop, and then you've got the smaller scale private streets and private drives and shared access ways. And then you'll see the yellow square dots all the way around the edge of the site is a footpath that will give access, public access around the edge of the development. Next slide. This plan shows the setup of built development to open space. So you can see there's 1.46 hectares of open space, 2.6 hectares of residential, and I think that's 0.15 hectare of water, which would be the surface water attenuation pond, which presumably, like others, wouldn't be permanently wet. Next slide. So this is the sort of illustrative presentation layout. As I pointed out earlier, the development has been designed in clusters of buildings so that they're all outward facing. You don't get any rear elevations facing onto any streets or open spaces. The open space on the site has been located on the southeast side to soften the approach into town. The Spinney Hill development is quite harsh and close to the boundary of the PLD at the moment at the top side there. So this development has been designed very similar to the Blaw's development on Leicester Road in Uppingham, where you've got an arc of development that fronts onto the open space.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, we lost you for a second again there due to the Wi-Fi.
All right, where did I get to? Where did I get to? The development faces onto the open space, which is located in that bottom corner, so that's the first part of the development that you see as you approach the town. And then there's, as you see, there's new tree-lined streets, which is in line with the new advice in the latest MPPF. And then that footpath that runs down parallel with Uppingham Road is a combined cycle path that gives access, and there's footpath and cycle access out onto Uppingham Road in that top northeast corner adjacent to those three trees that we were talking about, as well as access onto Uppingham Road where the main site access would be. And then, as you can see further into the site, the hierarchy of roads sort of lowers down to private and shared drives. Next slide, please. This shows the distribution of the affordable housing units. The blue ones are the rented and the green ones are in shared ownership, so they're not all clustered together in one part of the site. Next slide. This shows the drainage strategy, because the land does slowly fall down to that southeastern point, and it simply shows that the surface water drainage would drain down into that balancing area and then be discharged into the watercourse on that bottom southeast corner of the application site. Next slide. And this is a detailed application, unlike the one that we've just looked at in Ketton. So all of the layout and the house types are now included for approval. But just going on to one of the issues that will sort of primarily surrounds residential amenity, I suppose. This is a photograph I took of the layout plan when I'd marked on some of the relevant dimensions from the properties proposed and existing and to the various boundaries. So Number 2 Spinney Hill actually faces out towards Uppingham Road. So the side elevation of that property faces onto the application site. And as you can see, between the boundary of that property and the edge of the footpath, there's a gap of 9 metres. From the boundary of the site to the footpath at that point, there's a gap of 4 metres. And then the nearest house, which would be plot 28, is 15 metres off that boundary. So there'd be no direct overlooking into that property at number 2. And with regard to number 4, there's a distance there of 36 metres from the front of that plot 29 to the rear of number 4, which and the newly adopted guidelines design guide states that rear to rear relationships should be a minimum of 21 metres. So we've got well in excess of that here, first floor window to first floor window, and there's the landscape strip in between. And then you can see the figures go to 37 metres, 27, 39, and then it shows there's a 9 metre strip within the Spinney Hill development at the moment there. And then from plot 35 to number 10 Spinney Hill, you've got a gap of about 44 metres there. And then from the plots that's sideways on to number 18, you've got another 38 metres there. So that's just to demonstrate that the distances between the various plots and the existing development are quite generous, so that there wouldn't be any impingement on residential amenity from that point of view. Next slide, please. This is a Google Street View simply down Uppingham Road with the application site on the left, and you can see the Spinney Hill development beyond it, and a field of similar character on the right-hand side. And then beyond that field on the right-hand side, you can see where the character of the area changes, which is where the conservation area boundary extends to. And that is primarily opposite the Spinney Hill development rather than opposite this site. Next slide. So these are, excuse me, these are illustrations taken within the layout as it's been proposed. The top one is the view coming into the main access road from Uppingham Road, which you see you've got the street trees and the open space on either side there. The second one is an example of the secondary street, which runs around at the top end. And then the bottom one is more of the lower hierarchy of road, which is sort of described as a lane. And you'll see where that bridge is, there's actually a swale that runs along parallel with the cycle path along the Uppingham Road boundary. And there are a couple of those footbridges to go across that to give access to the footpath. Next slide, please. This is further visual pack. So this visual on screen now is the view sort of looking over the hedge, if you like, from Uppingham Road, and you can see that cycle footpath with the swale behind it and the bridges I described. Next slide. So this is a plan that just shows where the following images are sort of taken from. The first one is the access coming in and then up the main road. And then you've got 5, and number 5 is on the central sort of small open space in the middle. And then 6 is similar to the one we've just seen before, I think. And then 7 is from the top corner. Next slide. So this is view 1, which is shown again on the map at the bottom coming into the development. So you've got the play area on the right-hand side, and further open space on the left with the street trees. I think that's been amended since an earlier version to have the street trees on both sides now. Next slide. This is going a bit further in. So you've got the open space. These houses on the right-hand side face onto that open space. Next slide. Again, that's looking up towards that green area in front of the plots where the number 5 is on the map at the bottom. Next slide. That's view 4, which you can see on the plan looking across that open space. And then the next one is further around to the right there, which is that one. And we're back. Yeah, that's the same photograph we saw earlier, number 6. And then finally, number 7 is in the top corner there. So on the right hand side there, you can see the footpath that runs down at the back of the Spinney Hill boundary and joins in the road network further around. And that's an image that was taken from an earlier set of images that we had, but it just shows to illustrate the relationship between the Spinney Hill properties, which are those in grey on the right, showing the gap between their boundaries and the boundary hedge of this site, and then the properties set well away from that boundary within the development. Next slide. And these are just 2 or 3 photos I put in of examples of Davidson's development in Leicestershire. They've done some recently in Market Harbour and Melton. Just skip through these slides, please. That's one in Melton Mowbray and Harbour again. So this site is adjoining the plan limits to development is for Oakham, as you've seen. Members are aware that Oakham is the most sustainable location for development in the county. The site was going to be allocated and had been approved for examination in the local plan before it was withdrawn. And it was one of the sites that were to have been allocated. So it's been through the full range of assessment in terms of its sustainability and durability and suitability for development. I'm coming back to it again. Paragraph 11D is engaged because we don't have a 5-year housing land supply following the withdrawal of the plan. That does carry significant weight. And if you look at paragraph 11D2 that has already been referred to tonight, which says that planning permission should be granted unless any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the framework as a whole. So first of all, you've got to identify that there are adverse impacts of the development. And if there are, do they significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits, which are the provision of new housing, which is desperately required, the provision of affordable housing, and some economic and social benefits that go with that. So in terms of the design, it's a high quality design. Our urban design officer has been involved in the evolution of the layout and design over the time that the application's been in. It contains an adequate amount of open space, footpath and cycle links, as you've seen. The surface water development, the surface water scheme has been designed so that it incorporates swales and the balancing area to try and deal with surface water on site before it's released into the watercourse at an appropriate rate that doesn't cause flooding downstream. In terms of residential amenity, well, really the layout, within the layout itself, the amenities of all residents would be protected, and I think we've demonstrated from the images that you've seen that there'd be minimal impact on the amenities of residents on Spinney Hill. Next slide. In terms of the landscape impact then, Spinney Hill, when it was subject to an appeal about 10 years ago, we were going through the same process with that site. It was suggested that there was no adverse landscape impact at the time, and the council did employ a landscape consultant to assess it at that time, and the consultant agreed with the applicant's submission at that time that there wouldn't be an unacceptable landscape impact, and the inspector did view the site from that bridle way down between Eggleton and Brook Road, which is at a higher level, and didn't consider that there would be an adverse impact. As I've said, there's quite a significant amount of green and blue infrastructure, and that open space location does soften the development as you arrive from the south. We touched on the conservation area. It's on the opposite side of Uppingham Road. There's limited impact on that, and no more than Spinney Hill would have done. It's interesting that the Spinney Hill appeal, there was no reference either by the council or the inspector in reaching her decision that there would have been any impact from the Spinney Hill development on the character and appearance of the conservation area. So I think that we can safely assume that the same would apply in this case. In any event, if there is less than substantial impact on the conservation area, then again, there are considerable public benefits to be derived from the development that would outweigh that less than substantial harm. Highway safety, the new access onto Uppingham Road has been detailed up in a bit more detail just recently. So you'll see from the addendum that there is a further revised plan that shows some more information that the Highway Authority wanted with regard to design and visibility. The internal layout is acceptable. Parking is in accordance with the policies in the development plan. So from a highway safety point of view, there's not considered to be any major issue. With regard to noise, this is covered in the addendum at some length. The Environmental Protection Officer brought our attention that some new building regs are coming into force in June. So this development would need to comply with those, and they deal with noise in particular at night when it's warm and you have to have the windows opened for ventilation and that sort of thing. And the Environmental Health Officer is confident that Condition 8, as suggested and possibly beefed up a little bit, to take account of that, will deal with any issues from noise from the railway in particular. And as I said earlier, the new dwellings will have to comply with the new building regs in any event. So whether we put a condition on or not, they would still have to comply with noise requirements of the building regs. In terms of sustainable drainage, well, I've shown you the drainage strategy, and it would drain to that pond within the open space. Ecology, there's clearly little interest on the main part of the site because it's productive arable land. There are hedges and trees around the edge of the site which will be maintained. There's a very comprehensive landscaping scheme been submitted that contains primarily native species which will help improve the biodiversity as it stands on the site at this point at the moment. There was a point raised about the quality of the agricultural land, because when the strategic assessment was done for the local plan, it suggested that this land was grade A agricultural land. And one or two objectors have latched onto that, but the applicants have had a much more detailed survey carried out and sampled of the actual site itself. And that's set out in the report, and you'll see that it's not actually grade A agricultural land. And it was quite clear that the advice is that those strategic assessments shouldn't be used to guide the assessment of an application on a detailed low-level localized site. So the site is sustainable. It's right on the edge of the most sustainable settlement in Rutland. We do need the housing. We don't have a 5-year housing land supply. It's not easy to challenge government policy on the hoof in this way, and members need to be very wary of trying to do that and the consequences of trying to do so when we get to a subsequent appeal, because it would be very difficult to defend an appeal on this particular occasion. Look, going back to that paragraph 11D2, the adverse impacts, well, officers review that there aren't any adverse impacts. There's no impact on archaeology, ecology, highway safety, environmental issues. So there aren't any adverse impacts, which would have to, in any event, significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of providing this new housing. So on that basis, Chairman, it's recommended for approval.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoggett. Right, we have various people waiting to speak. Zena Dayton, have I pronounced that correctly? And again, you have 3 minutes and 3 minutes of questions. So when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, giving a resident's perspective on this development. Firstly, not only are we neighbouring residents of Spinney Hill, but also residents of Oakham, a town we love and are proud of. So we are concerned about the effects this development would have upon a main gateway to our historic town, being as it would be a finger of development beyond Oakham's current natural boundary line. Secondly, this proposed development will build houses which are not environmentally friendly or sustainable in terms of the fuel they will use, the light pollution created, and the adverse effect on the biodiversity and the natural habitat which has flourished in the hedge and wilded zone between Spinney Hill and the agricultural field beyond over the past few years. Prime, good quality agricultural land will be destroyed and lost permanently. Also of concern, the density of the houses. Is it 84 or is it the council's recommended 74? The use of space on the proposed development combined with height and design of some houses, including 3 stories, cycle tracks that don't join up, and a frontage on the road which will not shield the unsightliness of the development for years to come. An artist's impression of this view has been made available to you. Of course, people need somewhere to live, but not to the detriment of current residents of Oakham. Oakham can hardly manage its need for primary health care at the present time, or indeed satisfy the numbers of places in schools for existing children, let alone any new residents. Page 56 of your pack shows that the developers actually met a few of the residents. But I would have to say that that list is not a representation in any way of what the residents asked for at that meeting. It looks good, but it actually doesn't amount to the conversations that we had. The only one I would draw your attention to is an updated noise survey, and I want to refer to that. I would ask members to look carefully at 2 particular technical reports submitted by the developers, which, if you found them not to hold water, you might feel discredits other aspects of this planning application. Firstly, the noise report, which has been mentioned. More freight trains using the line since 2018, a lot more in the future, we know that, resulting in lower noise readings, according to the independent report. How can that be? Secondly, the developer's independent report on soil quality rate, as Nick talked about, it was come out as a grade 2 with patches of 3A. And yet DEFRA and the Cranford University, not that many years ago, from their databases, rated it highly as being grade 1 and grade 7, respectively. As a layperson, that doesn't make any sense to me. Does land really change that quickly? I will do my best, Chair.
Thank you.
I have endeavoured to deliver my presentation not from a NIMBY perspective, but taking account of what Oakham as a town will lose. Its iconic green southern approach combined with the detriment upon the environment as a whole and the strain on services and current infrastructure if this development goes ahead. In conclusion, you might say, isn't it ironic that 40 people plus, including myself who live on Spinney Hill, should oppose this development, as did the council oppose it when it was put forward firstly some years ago. However, the contrast between some aspects and the quality of Spinney Hill compared to this development are numerous, but the reality is Spinney Hill is there now. So whether you opposed it or whether you did not, as my late mother would say, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Therefore, I would urge you to reject this application for the reasons I and others in their submissions have outlined. Lastly, and this really is the last point, should this large and complex application be approved, the residents feel that there are a number of reassuring and additional conditions and mitigating measures we would like you to consider imposing on the developers before any decisions are taken as to what these should be. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Members, you have 3 minutes to ask any questions, should you wish to do so. I don't see anything, so thank you very much indeed. We now move on to the 2 ward members, and I'd remind members of the committee that there is no no provision for time limiting on this, so I would simply ask the ward members to be as succinct as possible. Having given you that steer, Councillor Paul Brown, who of course has declared an interest and will leave once he's made his statement. Councillor Paul Brown.
For the sake of brevity, I won't go through the analysis of court cases on the meaning of 11D, but I would like to say that one aspect of that 11D is it says it's a presumption. It's headed up. It's a presumption for sustainable development. And as such, you have to look at it that way. A presumption legally is rebuttable. Not only that, Rutland still has a valid local plan, 2011. It is conceded that the policies and provisions have much less weight today. But there was again a recently decided decision, and I'm sorry for bringing in legal aspects, but it is relevant. The Court of Appeal in Peel Investments versus Housing Communities and Secretary of State, it was held that in such circumstances, namely when an out-of-date plan, that the policies of that plan are not necessarily lacking relevance, where they are still relevant to the present day and have not been overtaken by legislation. Your presenting officer today has cited core 211 core plans. So he acknowledges the relevance and validity. And I'm going to refer to some of those later on for that reason. I pointed out earlier on that there are differences within the NPPF as to what are major planning considerations and what aren't. Paragraph 11A is the first one of those, where it states that all applications should be for sustainable development. This is now a much abused word, which is commonly abandoned about and often inappropriately. Fortunately, the PPF itself defines it. It says sustainable development must meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I would submit that by strict interpretation of that statement, it is not unreasonable to find that any new property that is heated by churning out pollution from fossil fuels is automatically compromising future generations' needs. This is exhibited in the preliminary utility reports, which is put forward by the developers, where it states that there is a provisional costings for gas supply to this site. It therefore appears clear that this form of heating has been accepted by RCC as going to be used on this development. And again, I'll come back to that. Paragraph 8, another major one, says that sustaining development has 3 overarching objectives. That is the wording, 3 overarching objectives. The officer's report says they have all been met. I would submit there is an alternative view on that. Looking at them, the first one is economic. It states within that the right land in the right place. The officer's report reminded us that this was assessed as being suitable for development and deliverable. This meant that it was a designated preferred site within the withdrawn local plan. In any event, such a designation of its preferential status has been swept aside and withdrawn with the local plan itself. Councillors can therefore now exercise their own judgment on this site, which arguably takes up one of the few pieces of grade 1 farmland existing in this county. That incongruously sticks out like a pointed finger into open countryside, that creates the impression of an urban projection with some prominent three-story properties, and that does not really give characteristics of an ancient county town to visitors entering from the south, all of which are stipulated as core policies within the 2011 structure. So is this the right place? The second overarching objective deals with social matters. It states it should be fostering well-designed and beautiful and safe places with accessible services and open spaces that reflect current and future needs for supportive communities, health, social and cultural well-being. Words are important here when they refer to current and future needs for community health and social well-being. In respect to primary health, councillors will be aware, and this has been referred already to tonight, that there's been so much concern that Rutland County Council established their own task and finished committee to consider the problem. The committee is yet to report, and the evidence is therefore not yet in the public domain. But out of the 902 county-wide responses that were received, 536 referred solely to Oakham medical practice. I'll leave you to form your own opinion on that. But the only current official document that I believe exists where the NHS acknowledges this problem, and I found this out through a Freedom of Information, is a statement of common ground entered between Rutland County Council and the East Leicestershire Commissioning Group in December 20, which states at 313, the available capacity of existing medical practices that serve the current residents of Rutland County is currently insufficient to meet the identified increases in homes and resulting increases in population. Any increase in population will require a commensurate increase in GP practice facilities. So the problem with primary care in Oakham is therefore a major identifiable defect in the infrastructure affecting this town, which can only be compounded by this proposed development. Notice it's the officer's contention, his point 49, which contention has also been offered in similar applications before this committee, that this will be resolved from SIL monies. The councillors will be aware that there are no specific plans to address this problem on the current horizon. And the wording of section 8 is specific. It says both the current and future needs. So neither of those heads are properly catered for here at present, nor in the future. Another pillar of the social needs is the schooling aspect. This is confirmed in paragraph 34. It is noted that there is no mention in the official report of any confirmation of whether anticipated increased requirements for primary schools can be catered for. The only multiplier that I could see that had been used in a previous infrastructure development plan was that of 0.27 primary school places required per new house. That would give 103 places for the approximately 385 new dwellings which are being either planning permissions being granted, are in process, or are being considered for being built in this ward. Schooling capacity has to be a material planning consideration, and considered estimates should be provided to help councillors to make such an informed decision. From the above reasons stated, it also states at 11A of the NPP, and I don't wish to keep going on either, but that's where it is, 11A of the NPPF, where it states development should align growth with and structure. It won't be met in these circumstances. Another material planning consideration is design. Paragraph 128 states the design should reflect the local character and design preferences. Section 130 states good architecture should be employed that is sympathetic with the local character and history. It's very much objective what is good design, but it is noted that the planning officer reporting on design states that this application does comply with government guidance, which cannot be denied because that is in fact quite nebulous. I don't think we've ever had any history of design coming before this committee that has not been passed. But both the NPPF and the core policies state that plans should respect and wherever possible reflect the local character. The local design officer on this occasion comments, but tactfully states, the homes are standard to the developer, but with the use of appropriate materials, they are not unacceptable. I would submit this is hardly a ringing endorsement. I cannot see that a development at Melton or at any other part of the East Midlands necessarily reflects the character of Oakham. In view of paragraph 134 saying the design has not only to comply with government standards, it also has to be sympathetic to the local character, the statement is in two parts and both have to be present. I'd submit that the compliance with the latter is deficient in this case. Alluding to this space heating by gas, the government has declared that by 2025, such heating will no longer be allowed in new builds. By 2035, spare parts for such a heating system will be in declining availability. Modern gas central heating systems have a life of 15 to 20 years. It will therefore be necessary from around 2035 onwards that all these properties will be required to retrofit with alternative heating systems. This is going to happen through every application that we're getting here. It is understood that the new future home standards interim set of requirements, which are going to be published this June, it is mooted to cover the likelihood of increased levels of insulation and measures to ease retrofitting. I've also spoken to Orange House Renewables, which are the only local engineers specialising in this field. I was advised that the current building regulation levels of insulation will not be sufficient to produce ambient temperatures where air source heating or any other currently available carbon-free heating has to be installed. The bore of the piping from the heater units to the radiator is different. The size of the radiators used to produce the same level of heating, if the insulation levels remain as they are currently permitted, will mean radiators of up to 2.5 times the size as they are now. The cost of retrofitting, if matters are not addressed forthwith and within this application for affordable homes, will be formidable. Standard for one last fact. According to the calculator in Joseph Rowntree Trust document, say at the CO13 for 400 pending houses in Oakham South, it would, if built to the current standard, will produce 2,293 tons of the worst kind of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. I say this is unnecessary, and I don't think it's going to be acceptable to the people of Oakham. As to other planning considerations in the NPPF, contrary to 11A, as I said, which also says mitigate climate control, contrary to 154, which says reduce the greenhouse emissions. It's contrary to our core policy, C1, which states development should have a minimum impact on climate change and include measures to take account of future changes in the climate. CS20, renewable low carbon decent developments. Buildings should aim to minimize energy consumption, alternative energies. All new buildings will be encouraged to meet the minimum energy standards. Beyond the requirements of building regs. I think that last phrase is quite important. I've previously been advised that RCC's position is that there is no currently effective local plan which incorporates such measures, and without formal building regulations that specifically cover such aspects, and without enforceable and precise directives from government, then they cannot enforce moving towards a zero carbon emission criteria. However, paragraph 129 of NPPF says that supplemental planning documents are a grounds for enforcement, and indeed have approaching equivalent weight, and that word is important, to a valid local plan. RCC adopted in their December 21 cabinet meeting the design guidelines for Rutland and South Kesteven SPD. The officers mentioned this at point 30, where he cites that in support of his submission for approval. But section 5B, and this hasn't been looked to, states that under the heading buildings, there is so much that can be done at the individual building level. Super insulate first, be 100% powered by renewable sources, the energy consumption being met by mounted PV panels and or ground source heat pumps. It is logical to interpret this new SPD as providing RCC's empowerment to insist on developer compliance with that criteria for a minimum energy efficiency standard to be adopted. This is the first major planning application to be heard since the adoption of that policy. Lastly, and you'll be pleased to hear, there is by chance evidence of a growing biodiversity area affecting the applicant land. To the rear of 2 to 18 Spinney Hill, there is a long corridor, which you can see from the plan. It goes from 2 meters to 7 meters wide. It has been secured on the side of the housing with a 1.8 meter high mesh fence, to which they have no access. This area over the last 3 years has effectively rewilded itself, and there is an explosion of biodiversity within it, which is increasing year by year. This year we had bats passing along the corridor because of the level of insects. Adjoining properties have moved from having initial concern about this being a bit of a wilderness to pleasure and appreciate the resulting emerging biodiversity. This was flagged up to officials in July 21 and at the site meeting of the 13th of August. And the developers, and this was pointed out on a request that a reciprocal area on the side of their boundary be created with a continuous green corridor extension down to Uppingham Road. This can be achieved by moving the footpath, which was initially 1 to 2 meters, and now it's gone to 4, further south. This would also provide a sufficient ground root protection for the 3 substantial trees for which we've asked for the TPO, as referred to by Mr. Hodges. Regrettably, the latest applicant's revised habitat report, probably because the habitat did not exist in 2020, hasn't noticed this developing site. Whilst the applicant has addressed and revisited certain points raised at that meeting, they have submitted a revised plan which shows the verge on the northern boundary has only been slightly widened, but it's felt that the position of this footpath is still too close, that the benefits of this emerging biodiversity area will be curtailed. I also note that they have applied for 83, the permission is for 83, but the RCC's calculation should be that it's a maximum of 74. There's no explanation in the report why the planners feel that exceeding their policy calculations is acceptable. I'll try and, in conclusion, I really want to submit that it is necessary to consider that presumption to 11D in its fullness. The major thing is any adverse impacts of doing so, i.e. granting permission, would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies of the framework taken as a whole. What my submission is sought to do is outline the numerous and important material planning considerations as detailed in the NPPF. Also detail the compliance, non-compliance with other considerations that have the authority of the NPPF. Detail the new policy as stated in the SPD. Detail where it fails to comply with our exempt local plan.
Sorry, Councillor Brown, are you about to conclude?
And it shows, and to show the defects cumulatively, because it can be cumulatively, are both sufficiently overwhelming reasons to overreach these minimal benefits that this application will bring. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, I'm very aware of the time. I would like to try and resolve this evening. I've still got two more speakers to call. Thank you. Those in favour, please, I take it. Well, sorry, okay, Nick. Yeah.
I'm chair through you. I'm incredibly concerned that such an important development. We've got 35 minutes to discuss it. I will feel rushed.
I am equally concerned, and I take your point that we have been here since 6 o'clock. You mentioned it last time. It is a matter of a delicate balance between allowing the people who are quite rightly have very important points to make. And Councillor Brown, don't mind me saying this, I did discuss with him before this meeting how we proceeded. And I'm very aware that we've got the other ward member waiting and the agent. I'm really in your hands as a committee. Councillor McCartney.
Are we able to carry on and then adjourn until another meeting?
If we do adjourn, we have always the difficulty of finding a further thing, but I absolutely share your concern, Councillor Beggy. I would not want this to in any way look rushed. If we are going to adjourn, my feeling would be that we adjourn now, that we could possibly deal with the Uppingham one in that time, because I don't think it's contentious, and that would remove that from the next thing, and we then started the adjourned meeting continuing this. And I'll bring the legal officer in.
Yeah, I think if we are going to adjourn, I think we should listen to all the speakers and then bring it back to the next committee just to debate. I think that just seems the most sensible way to deal with that.
So you're suggesting that we do precisely that. We just hear the next two speakers, then we adjourn. Well, take the appeal.
Well, we're just going to defer, aren't we, discussing it until next committee?
Yes, that we don't enter into any debate.
Yeah.
Just a point of clarification, will the agent be given the same amount of time to speak as the previous speakers?
We have in fact got time to do that before 10 o'clock. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the agent obviously is time. I mean, it's only the ward members who are allowed to speak for as long as they want. So
I'm looking over the head of the immediate person, the ward member, to say that I was making the assumption, perhaps unfairly, that he would not have quite the same length of speech as a fellow ward member. Is that a fair assumption? No, it is not. I shall simply have to go with that. If we get to the stage where the ward member has occupied more than, what are we now, 9:25, I would like the agent to be speaking not later than 9:45, probably 9:20. If not, I will adjourn at that point. And sorry, the agent will then get first crack at the resumed thing. I prefer not to do that, but I think that would be, I'm looking legal officer, I think that would give a fair share.
Chair, I don't know what we need to do about the last one on the meeting. I don't know, that's not going to get done, so I don't know if people who are here for that, because it's not likely, we're not going to hear that this evening.
No, we're not going to hear
Yeah,
that
so
this
just
evening.
make people aware.
I think there is a member of the public, or my list as a member of the public for the Uppingham one, and I can only apologise and say I don't think we're going to get that this evening. If, yeah. Councillor Cross.
Listening to the opinion there, you know, it was suggested that we carry on and hear the deputations. We're now not going to hear possibly all of the deputations, and therefore I believe it would be far more efficient and fair to stop this discussion now, go on to the last application and get that over and done with.
I would second that.
I agree with William.
Can I do?
Well, yes, I mean, obviously what we're doing is we're deferring this matter. Obviously, we've got the agent yet to speak.
If
He
you
can come
wouldn't
back.
mind pausing
and
just
the
for a
other ward
second while we
member.
resolve
Yeah,
this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we can do that.
Well, defer.
Which would give us 35, 40 minutes. Yeah. If you're happy with that, members. But I'll just take
So
a
we
show of
just-
hands,
Just
please.
take a vote that we're going to defer that until, yeah.
Yes.
next.
So
In
so
that
to-
case,
sorry.
I'm going to adjourn any further representation and debate on the Oakham thing, and we will have to sort out a date to reconvene on that one. I will now move, hope Mr. Hodgett can hear me. Oh no, sorry, it's Mr. Johnson, isn't it? I will now move to
Sorry.
the Uppingham. Yeah. Sorry, we'd almost got there. An extension to 10 o'clock. It was proposed and seconded. All those in favour, please. Thank you very much indeed. And apologies for being rather indecisive over it, but I think we've got to the right conclusion. Thank you, Councillor Oxley. So if we move now swiftly to the Adderley Street Uppingham one, if Mr. Johnson would introduce that, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The applications for a demolition of the existing buildings at the site and redevelopment with a single dwelling. The application site you can see outlined in red on the screen. It's a former builder's yard, predominantly within the residential part of Uppingham. It's adjacent to the conservation area boundary, which runs along the northern boundary and then jinks in across Adderley Street. So.
Just point of clarification. The red line on there is not.
Yeah, no, so sorry, the red line that I've just drawn round doesn't show the jink to access. You'll see it more clearly on the next plan. Sorry, that was just to bring it to members' attention. Quite right is Councillor Cross, that the red line that you can see on my next plan goes in slightly. There's a jink in the access and then it follows around the site boundary. And the proposal is to demolish the buildings on site and, as I've said, a replacement dwelling. You've got Adelaide Street to the west of the site, and then residential properties surrounding to the south, east and north. And the property to the east in this location is a bungalow. I'll show some pictures. In terms of the application, the proposal itself, it's quite it's a mix of traditional and modern design to some extent, in terms of picking up on the industrial nature of some of the buildings that are on site at the moment, and so similar sort of mass and bulk to what's there at the moment, and I'll show some pictures of that. There has been some concern raised with regards to the finished materials, in particular the dark staining of the timber, and it is proposed to condition that the timber is allowed to, well, the details are submitted, but one option would be for it to weather naturally. The applicant's agent has written in and confirmed that they are agreeable to such an approach, which the conservation officer has said would be more appropriate than the dark staining. So this is the top of the road looking down from the high street, and the application site is off to the left-hand side in this picture further down. So this is a picture from within the site. This is the access way in. You can see the boundary treatment. There's a boundary wall and fence that is to the northern side of the site, and then go down the pictures. So this is now working our way round towards the west, where you can see the buildings that front onto the main road that are to be demolished, and you can see that they are not particularly attractive features in the street scene. Again, you can see a steel frame structure there, and then here you can see the properties to the south of the site, which are beyond and separated by a parking area and access way to the rear of those properties. And again, this just shows the single-story building to the rear of the site, which is proposed to be demolished as well. The site boundary, the application forms show that new boundary treatments of 1.8 metre timber fence would be installed around the site. If I just go back up to show those. So here you can see that the proposal is, I think, to rebuild the wall in this location, and then there's a 1.8 metre high fence that goes around the site. The property has been designed so that it looks into the site and doesn't overlook adjacent properties. This is the parking area to the 3-story buildings that I showed earlier, and this is the single-story bungalow that's at the rear of the site, and you can see that there's a proposed garden area at that bit. So the existing building that's on that boundary would be demolished, and the proposed building would be moved away from that boundary. So in terms of the key issues here, obviously, as I've said, the site is adjacent to the conservation area. That is a significant consideration. We'd seek developments to preserve or enhance the character and appearance. The conservation officer has raised no objections, subject to us controlling the colour of any cladding. And as I've already said, the applicant's agent has agreed to a condition to control that. Impact on residential amenity, again, given the layout and fenestration and separation distances, it's considered that the development would not have a significant adverse impact on residential amenity, and could be actually a more conforming use than the existing use that's there on site at the moment. And finally, in terms of the highway safety, the highway engineer has considered the proposals and raised no objections to the development, subject to securing a construction management plan, which is referred to in the report, but not in the actual list of conditions. So if members are minded to approve it, I would just suggest that we add the construction management plan that is required by highways just onto the list of conditions. Subject to that, Chairman, the application is recommended for approval.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Stainsworth, you've been very patient. Would you like to come forward? Thank you. Again, you have 3 minutes and 3 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Committee, by way of an introduction, my name is Alan Stainsworth, and my wife and I are the owners of a Grade 2 listed thatched cottage situated on the corner of High Street East and Adderley Street. I unfortunately was not aware of the application until the end of the public consultation period, which I think was mid-September 2021. But I am relieved to see that the application has received the support of the officers, and that it received no objections from Uppingham Parish Council. I'm aware that I think there are 2 neighbours who do not like the design of the proposed dwelling, but personally I think it's high quality, I like it, and it certainly will add and enhance the street view. I don't know whether many of you have driven down Adderley Street, but it's very narrow. In fact, just over 6.5 feet pavement to pavement at the entrance to Adderley Street from High Street. Cars are regularly parked on the pavement outside the Methodist Chapel, meaning that any commercial vehicle needs to drive over the pavement on the opposite side of the access High Street. This is clearly extremely hazardous to pedestrian users. The Norton Street access is completely unsuitable for commercial vehicles. Over a period of time, the residents of Adderley Street have got used to this yard being very lightly used. But I'm fearful that if this application is not approved, the residents may have to put up with the noise and nuisance of business activities, which are completely unsuitable for this residential area. The reason I raise this point is that the officers have described the subject site as a former builder's yard, but is not. It is a builder's yard, which is currently not being used as such, pending this application. I understand that the applicant's intention is to build the house for their own occupation. They are not developers, and if this application is not approved, there is a real risk that the site will remain in its existing use. I would urge the committee to approve this application. Just one point, Uppingham Market is on a Friday and not a Wednesday. I think it was part of the one of the conditions on planning. It's incorrectly specify Wednesday, I think for deliveries to the site.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stainforth. Okay. If you just stay there for a moment, if there are any questions from members. Seem not to be. Thank you very much indeed. And I would just preface this by saying I asked for it to come to committee simply because I felt it would not be appropriate for me to make an individual thing. I would welcome the whole committee's view on it. I don't intend to take any part in the debate. I do intend to vote. So over to you, members. Councillor Andrew Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. This looks like a big improvement on what's already there, so I'm minded to approve this application.
We have a proposal for approval. Is that a seconder? Or do you wish to speak, Councillor McCartney? Yes.
I also have asked Mr. Stainforth, was it? Sorry, a question that was only a quick one. The Methodist chapels, it's been converted into.
You didn't take the opportunity.
I didn't. I know. I'm just. Well, I'll ask you,
Yeah,
Chairman, or an officer. The Methodist chapels converted into houses now, isn't it, or flats or something? I think so. Those cars parking out there are presumably residents of the Methodist.
I'll get Mr. Johnson to answer that. Yeah.
In all honesty, I couldn't tell you as to what those cars are parked there for. It may well be that existing use, but I couldn't, hand on heart say I know.
Were you about to second, or am I looking at Councillor Blanksmith seconding? Thank you. Councillor Gordon Brown.
Just before we go to a vote, Chair, the only concern I have is this wooden cladding. I appreciate, and I always get worried when the officers say it's an improvement on what it was. It doesn't mean it's perfect. And we had some experience of that in another application not so long ago. You didn't indicate what colour that might end up as. I know the conservation was very unhappy about black, but it's not clear what you're proposing, Mr. Johnson.
The condition requires details to be specified. I think likely that we would probably want it to weather naturally is what the standard is, but the condition allows for that information to be submitted and we would assess it based on what's put forward.
So one would presume it'd be a much lighter colour than the colour that's proposed in the application.
Yes, and the applicants are aware of the conservation officer's concerns, and that condition would give us the control.
Any other members? In that case, it has been proposed and seconded. All those in favour, please.
Unanimous, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Moves us on then to the appeals, Mr. Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just sort out my papers. So we've had, I think, 4 appeals come in. The first one, 2.1, is at Sawpit Cottage for a front porch, which has been refused on the neighbourhood plan, off the back of the policies in the neighbourhood plan. So will be an interesting test case for how inspectors judge that, and that was the part of officers thinking behind that. It will be a useful test case. The next one is 9 Main Street, Barrow. This one is for conversion of the existing front elevation roof windows into pitch dormers. And again, concerns about the design and appearance of that one. So again, we'll wait to see the results of that. The second, 2.3 is then conversion of agricultural buildings to dwelling house. This was I think a Class Q application where there were a number of conditions on, and they're appealing the conditions. And I think part of this is all about the access way. We'd ask for a part of the access to be blocked up in between 2 sites. So if you know the exact background to it, do you want to explain?
Yeah. Yeah, so when the application first came in, it was proposing use of one of the existing field accesses, which when I visited site, you could see about 7 metres that way and about 13 metres that way. It was quite a shocking access to be used for regular residential use by a family. So I was, concerned about that. So I recommended refusal. The developer come back in with a different access position using one that had been previously approved for the neighbouring part of this, well, the same part of the site, but different Class Q conversions on the site. So and then planning colleagues wanted the existing access blocked off just to ensure that everybody used the previously approved access, which was acceptable in highway terms. And as Justin has said, they're now appealing against the condition which they proposed, which was and using the previously approved access. So yeah,
I mean, that one will purely come down to the technical side of things around the highways access and safety on that. The final new one in, which I think again is off the back of a Class Q, but then there was a full application at Manor Farm Barn, Thistleton Road, Market Overton, for an alternative residential building. So rather than build the Class Q, a large, I think it was Georgian style property, and it was felt that the building was too large and inappropriate, amongst other things. And again, that will be an interesting case that we will refer back to members when we have the decision on. And finally, decision-wise, replacement of 3 number wooden windows with UPVC sash windows. That was in Langham, and again, the appeal was dismissed. Impact on conservation area, and again, I think the neighbourhood plan was possibly referred to in that one as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Are there any questions? Councillor McCartney.
I get that we embarrassed ourselves a little bit when we turned down the class, when we approved the Class Q on T Road. That makes it inconsistent with Mr. Bartley's application for this motion.
Yeah.
How was the view on this application from Mr. Bartley being too big compared with that decision in Ridlington on that house being acceptable? I just had to
Well, I think the issue is each case on its own merits, but I think there that I suppose the argument in this particular in this particular case was all to do with what you've got under Class Q. We would have only allowed it as Class Q because it's outside the built framework and everything. So that this one is significantly above and beyond the design or the scale of the Class Q. But I think also the conservation officer had concerns about the appeal one. And again, if we could have got a scale and design that was appropriate and the conservation officer was happy with, then we may have supported it. It's just that they weren't willing to negotiate with us in terms of size and design. And I think that's the issue. Whereas the Ridlington one weighed up with the 5-year housing land supply issue, and forgive me, I know it's getting boring saying the same thing, but it has to be said, weighing that up and the design and it being appropriate in the conservation area, that's why we supported it, because as far as officers were concerned, there were no other policy reasons not to support that one.
What I'm just trying to do is find a date for the adjourned business.
I wonder, Chair, is it worth closing the public meeting before?
Sorry?
Is it worth closing the public meeting first before we
Before
start
we do
throwing
that,
around and speculating?
Thank you very much
speculative
indeed.
dates?
In that case, I've been informed no other business. So at 9:45 or thereabouts, I'll declare the meeting closed and still go straight on to saying